Chapter 374. Master Dean? At this moment, the other generals also came to their senses and were instantly stunned. The colonel bowed his head. There's no mistake. The name written on it is Master Dean. The new invention, steam gun, was donated to us by him. The generals were stunned. The blond, middle-aged man took a deep breath. Dean is the traitor of the temple that we have captured from the barbarians? How is it possible? We have investigated that person's information. Isn't he 16 or 17 years old? He has just become a senior architect. How could he be promoted to master in such a short period of time? If this legendary military divine art called steam gun was really created by him, then it's reasonable for the shrine to promote him to be a master, but… Another man slowly calmed down and said thoughtfully. The white-bearded old man sighed. Although the temple has always protected its own image, but the internal laws are strict. If Dean's invention is forced to be a legendary item, then I'm afraid the other masters won't be convinced. It would be a huge loss. I'm afraid that the steam gun is really a legendary weapon. It would be great if it could help the situation in the front line. The doubts in the bottom of their hearts dissipated as they heard the old man's words. One of them said, "If it really is a legendary item, then the little guy named Dean doesn't seem like a traitor since he donated it to us for free. After all, the price of a legendary item is millions of gold coins. 10 lifetimes of luxury wouldn't be enough to spend it all. Even if he carries a stigma, he can be sent to the inner wall to live and never return to the outer wall. Yes, he is too stupid if he is going to use a free donation to wash away the suspicion. It seems that we have to investigate this person. Although the architects of the temple aren't as noble as people think, but there are many masters who are worthy of admiration. If this person is wronged, then we will be in trouble." "That's right. We've offended the temple quite a lot this time. It's all because of those damned bastards. They didn't even clarify the situation before publishing the news. If it turns out to be a misunderstanding now, our military will lose all face." Everyone looked at each other and felt that this matter was rather thorny. Just then, report. A guard came to the side of the colonel. He saluted the generals and said, "Generals, Master Skagen of the temple has come to see General Lorenzo." "Master Skagen? He actually came in person? Are you here to denounce me?" The generals looked at each other. The white-bearded old man's face was gloomy as he said to the guard, "Quickly invite him over." "Yes," the guard answered and ran off. After a while, Skagen came to the hall under the guidance of the guards. The white-bearded old man was already waiting in front of the sand table. He slowly stepped forward as he saw Skagen's figure. It seemed that he deliberately slowed down the angle of the sand table. There was a big smile on his face. "Master, I haven't seen you for a long time. How come you have the time to come here today?" Skagen calmly glanced at the generals behind him. "I won't delay too much of your time. I have sent a letter to the military and I believe that your people have already passed it to you. I have come here in person on behalf of the temple and also on behalf of the new master of the temple, Mr. Dean. I have come to tell you 2 things. Lorenzo's face slightly changed, but he still maintained a smile on his face. "Master is really as swift as the rumors say. We just learned that Dean has been appointed as a master. We haven't had the time to congratulate him. I don't know what you want to talk about." Skagen calmly said, "First, we want to publish the news in the newspaper. We want to announce that Master Dean has donated the new invention for free. We need justice. Master Dean has generously donated the legendary item for free. Even if Master Dean didn't say it, we would have announced it in the newspaper." Lorenzo frowned. "It's just that the battlefield ahead is unpredictable. Although it's only a small headline position, isn't it a bit disrespectful to do so?" Skagen's mouth curved into a cold arc. "Is it? Is it possible that the legendary item we donated to you for free has nothing to do with the war? Although you haven't seen the legendary invention, but the Temple of Elements has provided military inventions from 1 star to 5 stars. Have we ever disappointed the military? Lorenzo's complexion changed. If he didn't agree, it would be the same as publicly slapping the temple's face. If he agreed, then he would have to lick back the spit he had spat on Lin Ming's body. Master, I think we have to discuss this matter, Skagen frowned. General just said that the situation of the war is changing rapidly. Shouldn't we put all our energy into the war strategy? Lorenzo's face sank. All right, I can agree to this. What about the second thing? Skagen continued. The second thing is very simple. Master Dean insists on going to the front line. I hope you can send the most elite soldiers to protect him. The temple doesn't want to see a master fall in this place. I believe that you also don't want to see a genius who is less than 18 years old, who has produced 2 legendary inventions die. It would be a loss for the entire giant wall. Lorenzo was startled. The generals who were standing behind him were also startled. They were angry when they saw Skagen's domineering appearance. But at this moment they doubted their ears. What was the front line? Even the generals weren't willing to go there. Especially in the current precarious situation. If the Golden Wall was captured by the barbarians, then the generals would find it difficult to escape death. The strength of an individual was as small as a grain of sand in the middle of thousands of soldiers. But this young man who had just received the title actually took the initiative to go to the front line? Why did he insist? Lorenzo came back to his senses. Master Skagen, are you right? Master Dean wants to go to the front line? Why don't you stop him? The front line is too dangerous. Even if we send the most elite soldiers, we wouldn't be able to ensure the safety of a person. It's too dangerous. And to tell you the truth, we can't guarantee that the barbarians won't be able to break through the Golden Wall in the next moment. Once the Golden Wall falls, we can only rely on the blessing of the goddess of luck to return alive. Skagen's face sank. We will stop him if we can. But he still wants to go. Moreover, you don't know that Dean is not only a rare genius, but he also passed the Knight's Hall test. Once he passes the test, he will become a real knight. He has the spirit of a knight. We wanted to send him to the inner wall so that he wouldn't return to the outer wall. Skagen's fingers slightly clenched in his sleeves. His emotions fluctuated as he said, but he didn't want to escape. In order to reduce the casualties of your soldiers, so that your money can be used on the battlefield, and to win this war, he gave up the fortune of selling this legendary divine art and offered to donate it to your army for free. For the sake of his knight's glory, he insisted on going to the battlefield himself. He used to be a hunter, but not long after, he was imprisoned. Now that he saw that the front line was in danger and that there were heavy casualties, he decided to go to the battlefield himself in order to do his part. Perhaps you would think that he wanted to save his reputation and prove that he didn't collude with the barbarians. But, generals, he is already a master of magic. Moreover, he is a master who has produced 2 legendary inventions. He could have taken advantage of the situation and sold the legendary invention to the military at a sky-high price. He could have made endless wealth. But he didn't do that. He could have entered the inner wall with huge wealth and enjoy a superior life and glory. But he gave up. He abandoned his glory and rushed to the battlefield. He rushed to the battlefield where he could die at any time. Chapter 375. Lorenzo and the other generals fell into silence as they looked at Skagen's angry expression. The vast hall was silent for an instant. After a moment of silence, Lorenzo slowly opened his mouth. Grandmaster, we will send our best soldiers to protect Grandmaster Dean. You don't have to worry about this. In addition, we will thoroughly investigate the confession of the barbarians. We will make sure that Master Dean is innocent. This matter is due to the negligence of the military. We didn't have enough evidence to support Dean. We are willing to take full responsibility for this. I hope that this matter won't affect the friendship and alliance between us and the temple." Skagen's anger subsided as he saw the serious expression on Lorenzo's face. "I hope there won't be a next time." Lorenzo nodded. "There won't be a next time. Please forgive me." Skagen knew that such a verbal promise was useless. But the key was the attitude of the other party. The anger on his face disappeared and his expression became cold. He raised his hand and two middle-aged men wearing white robes came in from behind the door of the hall. Judging from the medals on their shoulders, they were senior architects. One of them was holding a metal object with a strange shape. Lorenzo and the generals looked at the two as soon as they appeared. Their eyes were immediately attracted by the metal object. They assumed that this object was the legendary military item sent by the temple. However, it didn't seem to have any lethality and didn't have the slightest sharp edge. They couldn't help but be curious about it. "This is the legendary item made by Master Dean. Steam gun," Skagen indifferently said. "Generals, is it convenient for me to show its power?" Lorenzo was very curious. "Of course, this place is spacious. Master can demonstrate as you please." Skagen nodded and glanced at the hall. He found that there were no decorations. His eyes fell on the chairs. "Use this chair. General, please take off your armor and put the chair on the seat." Lorenzo and the generals were puzzled, but they still followed Skagen's method. Skagen nodded towards the architect as he saw that the target was ready. The latter respectfully nodded in response. Then he picked up the steam rifle and stood 15 meters away from the chair. "Generals, please step aside. Don't block the middle." Lorenzo and the other generals were astonished when they saw the way he was driving. Why did it look like a bow and arrow? After they left, the middle-aged architect aimed the steam rifle at the chair. He took out a match and lit the fuse on the side of the steam capsule. Then, he skillfully adjusted the second valve, pulled the lock wire and pulled the trigger. White steam shot out from the valve behind the rifle. At the same time, a metal bead was propelled by the white steam from the muzzle and suddenly shot out. Whoosh! The sound of metal colliding echoed. The sound of metal colliding was heard but disappeared in the blink of an eye. Lorenzo and the other generals who were standing on both sides of the chair suddenly narrowed their eyes. Their faces were filled with shock. They felt the hairs on their bodies standing erect. They were trembling with fear. They were able to become generals not only because of their strategies and military knowledge, but also because of their extremely high combat strength. They were able to guarantee that they would come back alive again and again in countless battles. But at this moment they felt as if the god of death had passed by them. It was too real, too terrifying. Their physique was higher than that of ordinary people. Although they were standing on both sides of the chair, but they felt their hearts tremble the moment the white steam came out of the strange weapon. Lorenzo looked back in a daze and saw a hole in the waist of the armor on the chair. Although this was the weakest part of the armor, but it was the armor used by the generals. Even a sword couldn't pierce through it. There was a trace of pride in Skagen's eyes as he saw the shocked expression of the generals. He was also shocked when he first saw the power of this legendary weapon. However, lethality was the secondary advantage of this weapon. The most terrible thing was that even a child with no fighting power could exert the full destructive power of this weapon. The horror of such a thing was not inferior to the flame explosion technique that was born in the Dark Church many years ago. In some ways it was even more terrifying. After all, the flame explosion technique needed a lot of energy to burst out enough power. It was inconvenient to carry. But this steam gun was different. It was light and compact. If it was used by the cult, then the destructive power would be 10 times more than the flame explosion technique. This. An elderly general swallowed his saliva, unable to come to his senses. The senior architect had pulled the valve and extinguished the flame. He stood quietly in the same place. Lorenzo and the other generals looked at him with fear and trepidation in their eyes. Lorenzo's face remained calm, but his chest slightly heaved up and down. He slowly opened his mouth, but his voice had a trace of hoarseness. This thing. Is it used like this? Skagen faintly smiled. Yes, the requirements of the steam rifle aren't high. As long as the user has the ability to aim at the enemy. Moreover, the range of the steam rifle isn't far. The maximum is 50 meters. This is the third gear. The second gear has a range of 30 meters and the first gear has a range of 15 meters. The speed of accumulating steam and the interval between shots will be different depending on the gear. This is recorded in the information of the divine technique. I won't go into details. Lorenzo looked at the spear-wielding divine envoy and said, This thing shouldn't be used here. Skagen replied, It's just a drill. The fire has been turned off. You don't need to worry. Lorenzo and the generals heaved a sigh of relief after hearing this. However, they were still a little afraid. After all, the range of this god's shooting was too small and the speed of the attack was too fast. Even if they were prepared, it would still be difficult to avoid it. If they were to relax for a moment, then they would be killed on the spot. It was too terrifying. A general turned around and lifted the armored chair. He saw a bead embedded in the back of the chair. He was frightened. He carefully reached out his hand and pulled it out. He looked at Skagen. Master, is this the little thing that caused the attack? Yes. Skagen nodded. Lorenzo and the other generals looked over and their complexions changed. They sucked in a breath of cold air. They hadn't thought that such a small iron marble could cause such a terrifying lethality. This is really an artifact. Lorenzo looked at the steam rifle in the hands of the architect. There was fear in his eyes as he said with a wry smile. Skagen indifferently said, Every legendary level military invention is equivalent to an artifact. The products of the temple never disappoint you. This thing can penetrate steel. It's terrible. The golden-haired middle-aged general said with lingering fear. If it is used on a large scale on the battlefield, the style of warfare in the future will be rewritten. Other long-range military magic will also be replaced by this thing. No wonder it is rated as a legendary magic. It really has the power to create a new era. Skagen said indifferently. The steel is too soft and the thickness of your armor isn't enough. It is normal for it to be pierced. You have seen the steam rifle. I hope you can make it as soon as possible and put it into the battlefield to reduce casualties. This is also Master Dean's wish. Skagen said indifferently. Master Dean, you have seen the steam rifle. I hope you can make it as soon as possible and put it into the battlefield. Lorenzo solemnly said. Our military will defend the Golden Wall. We will not disappoint Master Dean's expectations. Skagen looked at him and his expression softened. He nodded and turned away. The oracle who was holding the rifle came forward and presented it to Lorenzo. Lorenzo and the other generals had the urge to stop him when they saw him holding his spear. Lorenzo's heart was beating like a drum, but he didn't see any hostility or murderous aura coming from the latter. He stabilized his body and tensed his muscles. He was ready to respond at any time. General, I give you the rifle. The architect handed it over to Skagen. Lorenzo squeezed an unnatural smile on his face as he took the gun from Dudien's hands. This is the introduction of the steam rifle. General can rest assured that it is very safe as long as it is used properly. The architect said with a smile. Thank you. Chapter 376. After leaving the temple, Dean went straight back to the castle. He called old Foulin and others and briefly told them about today's event. When they heard that he was conferred the title of Master, they were shocked and speechless. The new invention that you submitted last time was really a legendary invention? Old Foulin's face was full of shock as he felt incredible. After all, the boy sitting in front of him was only a 16-year-old boy. He was able to produce a legendary item. But now he was able to produce a second one. This was simply unprecedented in both the ancient and modern times. Zendral, Nicholas, Crone and others were also shocked. The news was too shocking. A 16-year-old master who had produced 2 legendary inventions. Such a name was one of the best in the entire temple. Compared to his previous identity as a senior architect, the difference was like the clouds and mud. He had become one of the top figures in the outer wall. Dean sighed in his heart as he saw the shocked expressions of the others. It seemed that the title of master was far more profound in their minds than the creation of a new invention system. It was probably because of the prestige accumulated by the masters of the temple over a long period of time. Even old nobles like Old Fulin were no exception. For the divine emissaries of the shrine, the news of creating a new system of magic was far more sensational than the fact that he had become a master. After all, ever since the birth of the shrine, the 9 great systems of magic had been created in just a dozen years. However, in the long years that followed, no new system of magic had been created. It could be said that once his system of air magic was developed, he would be a living legend. With such an identity, he would be an existence that could call the wind and summon the rain in the outer wall. I didn't ask you to come here to express your feelings. Dudien's voice pulled everyone's thoughts back. I'm going to personally participate in the war with my new invention. I'm going to use action to reverse the negative impact caused by the Melon Consortium. So now I need you to do some preparation work. Old Fulin and others were startled as they stared at Dean in astonishment. You want to participate in the war? Old Fulin was stunned. Sandro said, Young master, you have just been conferred the title of master, and you are also a top master who has created 2 legendary magic arts. With your current status, the people will no longer doubt you. How can you personally go to the battlefield? It's too dangerous. What if something happens? Yeah. Nicotine also chimed in. Dudien glanced at him. Nicotine immediately stopped talking and showed a bitter face. Dean indifferently said, I have made up my mind. I didn't ask you to persuade me. My identity alone can remove the suspicion of most of the people. Moreover, the military will find a scapegoat to help me restore the previous damage to my reputation. But how is that enough? What I want is not to get rid of the people's anger, but to divert it. Whoever splashed dirty water on me, I will make him swallow it himself. Old Fulin frowned. Transfer? What does it have to do with your participation in the war? If you want to divert the anger, then we will have to find evidence to prove that the Melon Consortium is slandering you. Dean said, We don't have enough manpower, so we can't find evidence to pull them into the water. But once the war is over, even if we find the evidence, the emotions of the civilians will fade. Eventually the pain will be healed by time. We don't want to offend such a big consortium. So we can only take advantage of the chaotic atmosphere of the war to ignite the anger in their bodies. War? How? Old Fulin frowned as he didn't understand. Dean shook his head. It's a long story. In short, listen to my instructions. Nicotine, tell the Black Workshop to speed up the printing of leaflet. Post them in the commercial district and civilian areas. Hire more people and write down the news that I will personally go to war. Remember to render my image bright and tragic. Also write down the news that I have donated legendary items to the military. Also write down the news that I have become a master of the temple. You should know the specifics. I know, master. Nicotine bowed his head. His voice was full of awe. Dudien looked at Crone. Prepare some people to go to the battlefield. After the end of the first battle, spread the news that Melon Consortium is framing me. Write down the names of the people and the time and place. Write down the names of high-ranking officers and priests of the Holy Church. Don't write down their real names. Make up a fictional character such as Master Crone or Priest Crone. Do you understand? Crone was startled. Old Fulin and Nicotine were also stunned. I know. Crone reacted and nodded. Dean said, We have to do this secretly. Remember to hire a person so that I won't trace it back to us. Use the method I usually teach you. I know, master. Crone bowed his head. Dean nodded and looked at old Foulin. Patriarch, help me contact all the consortia except the Melon Consortium. Let them help me publish this matter in the newspapers. Hint to them that I will remember this favor if they perform well. But don't use my name to talk about these things. I know. Old Foulin nodded as he heard Dean's orderly arrangement. He knew that he was worrying too much. He was a little relieved. Dean looked at Sander. I'll trouble you to personally go to the Melon Consortium and use my name to talk to them. If they are willing to withdraw their slanderous remarks and clarify for me, then I will let bygones be bygones. Everyone will coexist peacefully in the future. But they must compensate me for the loss of reputation. 1,000,000 gold coins. In addition, they must give us a passage outside the giant wall. Remember to emphasize one point. As long as they are willing to agree, then I swear in my name that I will never target them again. Everyone will coexist peacefully. Sander was startled. Old Foulin, Nicotine and Crone were also startled. Let bygones be bygones? Peaceful coexistence? They had been in contact with Dean for a long time. They knew that the latter wasn't such a kind person. Do you remember? Dean frowned. Sandro recovered. I will remember. But will the Melon Consortium believe that we have been enemies with them for a long time? Moreover, are you really not going to take revenge? Dean replied. How can we attack if we don't let the enemy relax? They understood Dean's intention. They couldn't help but change their faces. There was a burst of chill in their hearts. At the same time, they were glad that such a person was on their side and not an enemy. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to sleep at night. When are you going to set off? Old Foulin asked Dean. Dean gently rubbed his fingers. It's still too early. I will set off when the Golden Wall is captured by the barbarians. Old Foulin was surprised. Wait until the Golden Wall is broken? Wouldn't the barbarians rush into the commercial district? I'm afraid. We will win the battle against the Melon Consortium as long as I set off. If I can repel the barbarians, then it will be a great victory for the Melon Consortium. There will be no chance for the Melon Consortium to make a comeback. But if the Golden Wall doesn't fall, then I will only get some cheers even if I repel the barbarians. What's the point of doing such a strenuous thing? Dean said in a flat tone. Chapter 377. Dudian looked at him. Patriarch, you seem to think too highly of me. Old Foulin was startled. I'm going to the battlefield to show a stance. Dean continued. In the minds of the civilians and the nobles of the consortiums, I'm just a gifted architect. Although architects are good at creating powerful items, but they are weak. Even those who know that I have the strength of an intermediate hunter don't think that I can play any role in a war. My personal strength is like a drop of water. Can't set up any waves. So I'll go to the battlefield earlier or later. As long as I'm there before the end of the war, then I'll win. Old Foulin slightly opened his mouth but couldn't speak. Dudian continued. I didn't say from the beginning that I'm going to the battlefield to be a hero. Of course, if a frail architect can do that, then the effect will be better. However, now was not the time. If he did not let these commoners experience enough pain, let them grit their teeth and break their hearts, how would he be able to incite their anger? If we don't make them lose their minds, then how will they dare to overthrow a plutocrat that has industries all over the outer wall? If only a small number of people experience the pain of war, then they will be abandoned by their families. They will be pushed to the edge of society. Even if they want to resist, they won't be able to. So let's let them suffer a bit more. Once anger and despair drive them crazy, then we will blow the horn of counterattack. There was silence in the study room. Old Foulin, Zendral, Nicholas, Crone and others looked at the teenager's indifferent expression. They listened to the calm words that came out of his mouth. They felt a chill in their hearts and spread to the limbs of their body. Old Foulin's eyelids slightly twitched as he looked at Dean. Once the Golden Wall is occupied by the barbarians, will the army be able to repel the barbarians by relying on your legendary items? If not, then I'm afraid. Of course. Dudien's tone was full of confidence. Although it will be difficult to kill the monsters outside the giant wall, but it will be easy to penetrate the barbarians' armor and hide helmets. In this world, although there was the invasion of the monsters outside the giant wall, which made the evolution of cold weapons more advanced, the smelting process was extremely developed, but the purification of steel was hindered by the lack of other aspects of technology. Therefore, the armor couldn't effectively resist the bullets of the steam rifle. Otherwise, when the first guns came out in the old era, the medieval European knight class wouldn't be defeated. Also, some strong and well-equipped cold weapons countries wouldn't be defeated in front of those countries who had the gun technology. They were unable to resist. Moreover, Dudien's steam rifle mainly used steam instead of gunpowder as the driving energy. Compared to the appearance of gunpowder in the giant wall, it was too long. However, it wasn't surprising. Dudien looked at the history of the Southern Song dynasty. The reason for the emergence of the rifle was due to the frequent wars in the Southern Song dynasty. Wars were the most effective way to catalyze the development of new weapons. From this, it could be concluded that the advancement of the weapons was inseparable from the comfort of the environment at that time. This was also why, after gunpowder entered the West, it quickly destroyed the repressive slave system of the West in the Middle Ages. The accumulated rebellions led to continuous wars, causing gunpowder to be highly valued by the Western countries. As the country that invented gunpowder, it declined in peace. It turned the country's most precious weapon into firecrackers to suppress the gods and pray to Buddha. Just like the current situation inside the giant wall. Although the barbarians had repeatedly harassed the border, but it was only a small skirmish. There were very few big movements inside the giant wall. Naturally, the people inside the Golden Wall were tired of pursuing powerful weapons of war. There were only 2 or 3 times when the barbarians broke through the fortress and approached the Golden Wall. But in these 2 or 3 times the barbarians came up with super weapons such as the god's artillery. However, after the invention of the god cannon, gunpowder did not continue to be invented and manufactured. The main reason for the appearance of guided missiles, assault rifles, and fire and thunder weapons was that the military, or rather, those in power, regarded gunpowder as a taboo. The artillery had become a taboo weapon. It wasn't used in ordinary small-scale wars. It wasn't even installed in the frontline fortresses. It showed how much the military feared it. As an architect, who would dare to study the taboo? It was like the scientists of the old era didn't dare to do experiments that violated the laws of the country. But the old era was different. Even if they violated the laws and regulations, they could escape to other countries. But in the giant wall they couldn't escape even if they wanted to. The people of the Dark Church also didn't dare to study gunpowder, because gunpowder was also a taboo in the Dark Church. Old Foulin was relieved as he looked at Dean's confident appearance. But there was a bitter taste in his heart. Although he didn't care about the civilians, but the thought of so many civilians being slaughtered by the barbarians made his heart feel uncomfortable and guilty. However, he knew that it was useless to say anything. From a rational point of view, he also thought that Dean was right. However, such extreme rationality was too cold-blooded. "I'll contact the consortia." Old Foulin sighed and got up. Dudien nodded. "You've worked hard." "No, you've suffered more." Old Foulin raised his thick palm and wanted to pat Dudien's shoulder. Chapter 378. Mel Family. The old patriarch of the Mel family was sitting in a luxurious room. Mel George was sitting in a chair with a gloomy expression. There were 2 figures standing in front of him. They were Mark and Sarah Mel, who was recognized as the most outstanding businesswoman in the noble circle. Both of them had an ugly expression on their faces. Wait until tomorrow morning. All the nobles, Knights and civilians will know that this bastard will become the youngest master in the temple. The wrinkles on George's weather-beaten face were like swords. His gentle eyes were now incomparably sharp. He coldly looked at the slender figure of Sarah Mell. Once upon a time, she was his proudest granddaughter. But now, he was filled with disappointment and anger. Temporarily block the news of Master Mostar. Don't let the directors of the consortium know. George stared at Sarah and said, "You have full authority over this matter. This was supposed to be your first glorious achievement after you entered the consortium. But you have the resources and contacts of the entire consortium. You actually screwed up this matter. You can't even deal with a person who has no background and identity as a pariah." Sarah stared at George. Sarah Mell bit her lower lip as she heard his suppressed anger. "Grandpa, I didn't expect that he would be so capable." In a short period of time after producing the lightning rod, he produced another legendary item. This is something that no one can predict. George slammed his palm on the table and said angrily, "You also what? Don't you know how to kill him before he resists? What did I teach you? When facing an enemy, you can't be soft-hearted, and you can't play tricks on them. Even an injured, skinny dog will turn around and pounce on you if it's cornered. Even if it can't hurt you, it will still dirty you. You can't even remember such a simple truth." Moreover, he was outside the giant wall for 7 or 8 days. He was cut off from all contact with the giant wall. You attacked him from the back, but you still couldn't put him to death. If you had tarnished his reputation and made him a wanted criminal by the military before he came back, he wouldn't have dared to show his face if you had produced concrete evidence to prove his crimes. How would he submit the invention? Sarah was startled. She bit her lips and said, "Grandpa, I know I was wrong. I will take responsibility for this matter." Responsible? George didn't laugh as if he had heard the biggest joke. He said in a cold tone, "What can you use to be responsible for him? Even if he is an ordinary master, he is not someone you can be responsible for, not to mention he is the youngest master. He has infinite possibilities, and he has also created a new system of magic. If the new system of magic can stand the test of time, do you know what kind of person he will become? If he wants to destroy the Melon Consortium, it will be as simple as killing a mosquito. All the nobles and civilians will target us and cut off all trade. Do you understand?" Sarah's face paled. She realized that things were more complicated than she had imagined. Her heart was full of remorse. She was looking forward to seeing the youth's desperate and helpless appearance. But now it seemed like her expectation was ironic and a joke. "Father," Mark said, "it's useless to blame Sarah. The little devil has just become a master, so his status is not stable. He doesn't have the time to establish contact. We can only go down the dark road. Isn't he going to the front line? We can send people to kill him in the chaos of the war. As long as he dies, he will lose all glory and halo." George looked at him and snorted. "That's the only thing we can do now. But we can only succeed. Failure is not allowed. Otherwise, the losses of our Melon Consortium will be immeasurable. Don't forget that there are 5 tigers staring at us." "I will. I will contact the military and let the Shadow sneak into his guards and kill him when he is unprepared. He is just an intermediate hunter. Although he has a rare magic mark, but his combat power is average. Moreover, he is a hunter. With the ability of the Shadow, killing him will be as easy as cutting vegetables," Mark said. George nodded slightly and glanced at Sarah. "During this time you go back and reflect on your mistakes. Stop all the work in your hands and wait until you reflect on your mistakes." Sarah Mell clenched her fists and gritted her teeth. "I know, Grandpa, I'm sorry." "Go," George said in a cold voice. Sarah Mell felt pain in her heart as she turned and left the room. George turned his head and looked at Mark after she left. "I heard that old Foulin has come to negotiate? Well, he wants us to compensate him with 1,000,000 gold coins? He also wants to seed a passage to the giant wall? He wants to take our money and then destroy us. That old fox has become more and more cunning since he left our consortium. I didn't think that he would be so cunning before. Mark slowly said, Father, how about we negotiate with them? Even if we give them 1,000,000 gold coins, they won't pose any threat to us. But if we agree with them, then they will think that we really believe in their words. It will be helpful for our assassination operation. Once the kid is dead, then we will make the old fox spit out the things. George nodded. Yes, but we have to act real. All right. Dean called Noyce after old Foulin and others left. He told him to decline any visit. Just as he had expected, in the afternoon of the same day, various consortiums came to visit him. There were also some rich people who had somehow gotten the news, as well as knight families, who had come to congratulate him. Dean saw an endless stream of visitors from the window on the second floor. There was a trace of emotion in his eyes. He closed the curtains and continued to study. The next day, Dean looked at the morning newspaper. As he expected, he had become a master. He had produced a legendary item for the military. Most of the pages were covered by the newspaper. Even the military newspaper had reported that he had donated the legendary item, steam rifle, to the military. The details of last night's battle at the Golden Wall were reported below. However, the military newspaper didn't clarify the previous confession of the barbarians. It was obvious that it was too fake to publish such a report at this moment. Dean was very satisfied. The military was very smart. In addition to the military, the temple's special report was even more exaggerated. Almost all the reports were about Dean. It included becoming a master, donating an invention, analysis of steam kinetic energy, and so on. The masters were invited to explain the advantages and disadvantages of the new kinetic energy, and so on. There was only one report that mentioned about the war at the Golden Wall. Dean smiled. He estimated that the entire Temple of Elements was in an uproar at this moment. After the appearance of the newspaper, there should be a lot of people in the temple who were involved in the research of gas element. However, most of them had reached a bottleneck in the original system and were trying to find a new breakthrough. They weren't valuable talents. Dean looked at the reports of other consortiums. Perhaps it was because he had sent people to greet them yesterday. All the consortiums had vigorously and actively reported about him. Even the Melon Consortium had spared no effort to publicize his affairs. There was not the slightest bit of nitpicking or bad hints. Chapter 379. The same morning, Scott Consortium. Everyone was arguing fiercely in the council hall. Chastov frowned as he waited for the debate to die down. He pressed his hand on the table and said, "Everyone, please be quiet." His voice immediately covered the discussion in the hall. Everyone looked at him with their mouths slightly open. Chastov said coldly, "It's over. It's meaningless to blame each other. If I remember correctly, when Rosie came back and offered to buy Master Dean's new magic at the price of a legendary item, no one agreed. What's the point of regretting it now?" Everyone had a complex expression as they heard his words. They looked at each other and sighed. Rosie, who was sitting next to Chai, sighed. She didn't take it seriously when she heard the words of Dean's young butler. That's why she only mentioned it symbolically in the council. She didn't insist on it. Perhaps if she insisted on it, then the situation would have changed. If the proposal was passed, then it would be a huge change for the Scott Consortium, the Chai family and herself. Unfortunately, the opportunity was in front of her, but she didn't insist on it. Hey! If we had been braver, we would have been able to purchase a new divine system for the price of a legendary divine spell. How could we not dare to trade a grain of sand for a grain of gold? An old man dressed in noble attire shook his head with a bitter smile, his face full of regret. Another person said bitterly, "Initially, we mocked Master Du for being too arrogant. Now it seems that we were too arrogant." Chai looked at the crowd and shook his head. He sighed in his heart, but he didn't feel too sad or indulge in the things he had lost. He immediately said, "Everyone, this matter is irreversible. The current priority is to have a good relationship with Master Dean. In addition, the military sent news yesterday that they need to buy a lot of steel materials. This is an unprecedented order for our consortium. Among the 6 consortiums, only our Scott consortium is in the mineral industry. Our steel is 10 times more than the other consortiums combined. The other consortiums will take the opportunity to raise the price if they want to make money. We have to find out the base price of the other consortiums as soon as possible. We just need to raise the price a little above the normal price and grab all the orders." Everyone became serious as they heard Chai's words. However, there were still a few people who couldn't help but sigh. Phillips Avenue. Magistrate. Inside a divine official's office, there were 7 or 8 divine officials sitting inside. They would occasionally walk around and pass some documents to each other. They were all wearing the same divine official uniform. The pure white fabric was outlined with golden cloud patterns, and the cuffs were fiery red like 2 flaming clouds. They were extremely beautiful. Wow, the youngest magic master in history, my God! Hey, look, it's written here, a 16-year-old double legendary level master. Double legendary level. There aren't many masters who can make legendary items in the temple. It seems that only Master Skagen and Master Timari are able to make double legendary level items. So he is the 3rd master with 2 legendary level items? You said he was a traitor and colluded with the barbarians. I thought it was very strange. Why would a high-ranking oracle collude with the barbarians? Look, he even donated a legendary divine spell for free. If such a person said he would collude with the barbarians, I wouldn't believe it. You guys, you call yourselves priests. Before there's any evidence, any appearance is false. It can't be used as evidence, let alone as a reference. What do you mean? Do you suspect him of colluding with barbarians? I didn't say that. I don't agree with him colluding with barbarians. I don't think he is a good person. In short, the evidence is the truth. I only believe in the evidence. Well, I don't want to talk to you, idiot. In the office, 3 to 5 priests gathered together. They were holding the newspaper and talking. In the corner, a slender figure was sitting in front of her desk. Her beautiful hair was combed to the back of her robe. She quietly looked at the newspaper in her hand with a quiet smile on her face. She said to herself in a very low voice, "I knew you wouldn't do such a thing. You're not that kind of person. You yearn for peace. Everyone has wronged you." Speaking up to this point, his expression suddenly turned gloomy. "I've also wronged you in the past." She was silent for a moment as she slowly turned the newspaper. Suddenly, a report fell into her eyes. Her face turned pale. "Go to the battlefield." It was raining again. On the golden wall, Auburn looked at the rain falling from the dark clouds in the sky. His tired face was pale. He had been commanding the battle for several days without any rest. The dark clouds hanging over their heads were like the god of death hovering in the sky, always looking down at them. His heart tightened every time the rain fell because it was the signal to start the war. "Pass down my order. Get all the soldiers to focus and defend the city walls with all their might." Auburn clenched the edge of the high wall. He gritted his teeth and said, "If the wall is there, we will be there. If the wall falls, we will die. We have no way to retreat. We have to fight." "Yes." Adjutant Junlang bowed his head and left. As the rain gradually became heavier, the barbarian army that was stationed more than 10 miles away on the plain in front of the Golden Wall was advancing in a majestic manner. Like the rising tide, they swept towards the already damaged Golden Wall. Auburn took a deep breath. The cold air flowed from his nose into his lungs. He pulled out his sword and roared, "Shoot!" Whiz, whiz, whiz. The black arrows flew out like a curtain of rain, enveloping the plains outside the Golden Wall. After that, they fell rapidly, and the barbarians who were charging at the forefront were immediately thrown off their horses. They were pierced by the sharp arrows, and countless of them were killed or injured. However, there were some barbarians who were holding shields. They used the shield to block the arrows and successfully rushed all the way to the high wall. There were more than 100 figures standing under the high wall. All of them were wearing armor that was different from that of the soldiers. It was the hunters' armor. Their weapons were also different from the standard weapons of the soldiers. There were whips, swords, spears, hammers, and so on. They are here again. Sergei's face was full of blood. His hair was messy. His armor was damaged in several places. He was holding a long spear. His eyes were coldly staring at the barbarians in front of him. He slowly clenched the spear that was covered with blood. Gwyneth held her sword in silence. Ready. Sergei looked back at her. Gwyneth nodded slightly. You defend, I attack. Roar. Roar. The shield-wielding barbarians roared as they charged forward. Some of them were crushed to death by the boulders that were hurled down from the golden wall before they could even get close. The rest of them were lucky enough to survive the boulders and successfully reach the foot of the golden wall. Kill. Hundreds of hunters roared in unison. They pulled out their weapons and roared towards the barbarians. In the castle, Dudian was leaning on the bed. His body was covered with a heavy quilt. He was holding the super chip reader in his hand. It was drizzling outside the window, but he was unaware of it. He felt a little cold, so he asked the maid to add another quilt for him. Why is it so cold today? Dudian frowned but didn't think much about it. He continued to immerse himself in the huge knowledge base of the superchip. Knock. He didn't know how long it took before someone knocked on the door. Dudian looked up and saw a human figure outside the wooden door. What's the matter? His eyebrows slightly wrinkled as he said to himself, You too, don't let me down. He took out a match from the drawer of the bedside desk and lit the secret report. After the secret report was burned to ashes, he lifted the quilt and got out of bed. He put on a set of knight's armor that he had made in advance. He put on his sword and hunter's bow and quiver on his shoulder. He looked at himself in front of the mirror. He had delicate facial features and black hair. At the moment his posture was straight and his appearance was full of vigor and fighting spirit. He looked like an excellent knight. Dean was quite satisfied. He opened the door and went out. The joints of the armor rubbed against each other as he walked. Metal boots made continuous thumping sounds as he stepped on the ground. Dean went downstairs and stood in the hall. The servants were surprised to see Dean's appearance. Some of the younger girls were blushing and didn't dare to look at him. Master Dean, are you going out? Jake stammered as he saw Dudian. Dean nodded and patted his shoulder. You will take care of the old man. His legs are inconvenient, so you should help him. Yes. Jake was flattered. Dean's every move seemed to be full of majesty since he became a master. Jake was in awe of Dean. He didn't think that there was anything strange about Dean's words. Dean nodded and asked the servant to bring him a raincoat. He put it over the armor like a cloak. Master, the carriage is ready for you, a servant said in a trembling voice. Dean said, I'm going to war. Why do I need a carriage? Bring me a horse. Chapter 381. Master, the letter has been sent. It should be delivered in a quarter of an hour. Noyce trotted over and reported. Dudian nodded. Have you settled the civilians that you hired? I've already hired them. They're waiting for you at the departure point. Noyce lowered his head. Dean nodded slightly as he looked at the drizzle outside. His eyes narrowed. The rain seemed to last longer than the past. After a moment, Reed led a heavily armed team to the front of the castle. Civilians and several blonde nobles who were gathered outside the castle were surprised as they saw the team. Although they loved Dudian, but they didn't dare to show any disrespect in front of Reed's team. Reed saw Dean waiting in front of the hall. He dismounted and trotted over. Greetings, Master Dean. Dudian nodded. Let's go. Reed's face turned ugly. Master Dean, we just got the news. The Golden Wall has been occupied by the barbarians. General Auburn vowed to fight to the last moment and died in the line of duty. I'm here to tell you to rest at home. The battlefield is too dangerous, so we can only retreat to the second line of defense and fight with the barbarians. Dudian was surprised. The Golden Wall has fallen? Yes. Reed bowed his head. Dean's expression was complicated. He seemed to have made up his mind. He gritted his teeth and said, "In that case, I have to come out. Now is the time when we are in need of manpower. Your military headquarters has been fighting in the rain for a long time. I guess many soldiers have fallen ill. Now that you are short of manpower, instead of forcing ordinary people to die on the battlefield, it is better to let someone like me, who has the strength of a knight, go to the battlefield. I dare not say anything else, but I can at least beat dozens of civilians." Reed was startled as he looked at Dudien's determined face. A sense of shame rose in his heart. "Master Dean, I don't dare to underestimate your strength. But the battlefield is too dangerous. Please stay at home and rest." Dean looked at him. "I'm going to go to war. I've talked to the military about this matter. Do you think it's that easy to change the commitment of the military?" Reed's face slightly changed. "Master Dean, you misunderstood me. I'm just trying to persuade you. I'm not determined to stop you. I'm just trying to persuade you. You don't need to persuade me. Let's go. The situation is critical. What kind of men are we?" Dudian waved his hand and bypassed the burly man's body. He mounted a horse. "Let's go." Reed's face turned red as he didn't expect Dudian to be so decisive. He hesitated for a moment and sighed. "Master Dean, you can change to my horse. Our military's horses have been trained. Private horses like yours haven't been to the battlefield. I'm afraid that they will be scared if they encounter mutant beasts or barbarians that cross the Golden Wall." "All right." Dean agreed to the proposal and simply jumped off the horse. Hiding a suspected senior hunter in the escort team. Is it to prevent any danger? Dudian slightly frowned as there were some doubts in his heart. There were many possibilities, including that the military had sent this person to assassinate him. However, he quickly overthrew such a possibility. After all, if he was assassinated by the escort team, then the responsibility of the military would be too big. Although he couldn't think of any conclusion, Dudian didn't directly ask Reed as he didn't want to alert the enemy. He just secretly paid attention to this person and kept a certain distance. After a moment, Dudian and Reed led the team to the main street. There were 50 or 60 figures gathered in the square of the street. They were wearing raincoats and holding umbrellas. They were wading in the drizzle. These figures raised their umbrellas and loudly cheered Dudian's name as they saw Dudian's team. Reed slightly frowned as he was a little vigilant. He was in case the Dark Church or some bad guys hid in the crowd and attacked Dudian. The team moved forward in a straight line. The civilian team followed in the rain. They shouted Dudian's name and some praises. It was extremely lively. They attracted a lot of people who lived in the houses along the road. They opened their windows and doors as they heard the people shouting Dudian's name. Some people joined the team and shouted passionately. Dudian smiled as he drove the horse forward at a steady speed. For him this was a show. Only through a show could he maximize the effect of the battle. Only their relatives and friends knew that they had died in the battlefield without saying a word. This was the work of a hot-blooded hero. Dudian obviously wasn't a hot-blooded person. Master is really loved by everyone. Reed looked at Dudian as he listened to the continuous cheers. His tone was full of admiration. Dudian smiled. Treat others with kindness and you will get kindness in return. This is the truth, isn't it? Master is right. Reed agreed. After a moment, Dudian and Reed's escort team left the bustling commercial district and came to the suburbs. Reed's expression turned serious as they entered the suburbs. He ordered the team to protect Dudian in the middle as they moved forward in a diamond formation. While changing the formation, Dean suddenly noticed that the shield swordsman with extraordinary strength was the first to get close to him, and the rest quickly gathered and surrounded Dean. Dean looked left and right from time to time, but only when he looked at the swordsman on the left. His eyes paid a little attention. Dudian stopped his horse as they came to a plain near the river. The guards around him quickly stopped and looked at Dudian. "Colonel, is the river in front of us?" Dudian looked at Reed. "Do you want to take me to the second line of defense at the river? As far as I know, it's just a preliminary barrier. If the barbarians don't attack the commercial district from the river, but take a detour through the snowfield in the north or the Blackwater swamp in the south, then we won't be able to stop them in time." Reed forced a smile and said, "Master, there are soldiers in both places. If there is a trace of barbarians, then we will immediately send an army. The battlefield at Red River is the safest. The barbarians won't be able to attack for a while because of Red River's blockade." "The safest?" Dudian deliberately showed anger on his face. "Colonel, are you looking down on me? I'm going to the battlefield not to be protected but to take you to kill the enemy. But you are taking me directly to the safest place. Why would I go to the battlefield instead of staying at home? Why kill the barbarians? Are you saying that everyone here is a coward who is afraid of death?" Reed's face changed. The faces of the guards around Dudian also changed. They clenched the ropes and looked at Dudian in anger. But they didn't dare to refute. "Master, every one of us is a warrior who has gone through countless battlefields. We have countless merits and scars. I hope you won't insult us," Reed said in a solemn tone. "It's an order to take you to the river. We can't let anything happen to you. I can understand your mood. Everyone here is eager to go out and kill the enemy. But I hope Master won't make things difficult for us." Dudian frowned as he felt that it was a bit tricky. It seemed that he was negligent. Although the military had agreed to let him enter the battlefield, but they had locked him up. They were worried that something would happen to him. The military wouldn't take full responsibility if anything happened to him. The guards in front of him said that they were protecting him, but in fact they were jailers who imprisoned him. Chapter 382. Dean looked around and his eyes fell on Reed. "Colonel, I won't force you to go to the battlefield because of the military order. But it's your duty to abide by the order. It's not my duty. You have no right to restrict my freedom. Please remember that I'm not just a weak architect but a knight. Although I haven't obtained the official identity of a knight, but I have passed the knight's written test and inherited the knight's spirit. What is the purpose of me donating the legendary item to the military for free? I hope that you can save the cost and invest it into the war so that less blood will flow and less people will die. Every death of a soldier means the destruction of a family. Don't tell me that you don't have parents? I believe that everyone here is very clear about the knight's spirit. Fight for glory, fight for the protection of the weak, fight for justice and fight for the happiness of all people. This is what a knight should do. This is also my knight's code." Dean's eyes were like torches as he spoke in a righteous tone. "Now you want a knight to cowardly hide in front of the barbarian attack? Watching your compatriots fall in front of you from the safety of the line of defense." He took a deep breath and spoke in a sonorous tone. "I respect all of you for abiding by military orders. But I'm a knight. Even though I haven't been appointed by the Knights' Hall, but at least I have an identity. That's a human. A man with courage. It's better for you to kill me now than to watch my compatriots die. It's humiliating and blasphemous to live like this." Reed and the others' faces changed. Some of them felt their blood boil as they heard Dean's words. They clenched their weapons and gritted their teeth to endure. Reed's heart shook as he looked at Dean's face. His ears were hot and his blood was burning. It was as if a flame was about to burst out from his chest. He took a deep breath and bowed his head. "Mr. Dean, I'm sorry." Dean's heart sank as he heard the word sorry. His face turned gloomy. He stared at Reed and said, "You are worthy to be a colonel. Military orders must be obeyed. I admire you. But I said that the military can only command you. You have no right to command me. Reed's face changed. Master, please don't make things difficult for us. Dean indifferently said, I'm not making things difficult for you. It's you who are making things difficult for me. If we enter the battlefield, then we can kill a lot of barbarians. Every barbarian we kill is equivalent to saving a soldier and a family that has been destroyed in the war. I don't know what you think, but I can't stand the sound of crying in the streets after the war is over. It will give me nightmares. Reed's face turned ugly as he clenched his teeth. He couldn't wait to blurt out and agree to Dean's words. But military orders had long been engraved in his bone marrow. It was because of these words that he became a senior colonel. Dean took out a roll of map from his backpack and spread it on the horse's back. He scanned the map and soon aimed at a circle mark. He looked at the surrounding route and put the map into his backpack. He looked at Reed. Colonel, you go to the Red Tail River. I'm going to Scarlet Canyon. Scarlet Canyon? Reed was startled. The barbarians are bound to sweep the commercial district if the Golden Wall is broken. They will first reach the Red Tail River. But if they see that it is difficult to cross the Red Tail River, then they will turn to other places. Scarlet Canyon is in front of the Blackwater Swamp in the south. If the barbarians go to the south, then they are bound to pass through Scarlet Canyon. Dudian slowly said, Scarlet Canyon is steep and difficult to climb. The path in the middle of the canyon is only 6 or 7 meters wide. It can only allow a small team to pass slowly. I will stay at the entrance of the canyon and fight with the barbarians. Reed was stunned. His eyes lit up as he looked at another young archer. Jesse, give me the map. The young archer quickly took it out from his bag and handed it to Reed. Reed shook the map and quickly looked for the location of Scarlet Canyon. He looked up and down. There was a trace of surprise on his face as he looked at Dean. Master, how did you find this place? This geographical advantage is too good. Dean raised his eyebrows. There was a puzzled expression on his face. He had looked at the map many times in the past few days. He had made sufficient preparations in order to wait for this day. Reed saw Dean's puzzled expression and immediately explained. Master, on one side of the Scarlet Canyon there is a big lake. There is a lot of mutated snakes, lizards, and some jungle beasts. Even elite troops would suffer heavy losses if they passed through there. The safest way is to pass through Scarlet Canyon. But Scarlet Canyon isn't very safe. There are rock snakes, stone beasts, and other monsters. Moreover, if you are ambushed, then you can throw boulders from the top of the canyon and the whole army will be wiped out. It can be said that there is no good way to go. But most people will choose Scarlet Canyon. At least they are fast enough. Dean said, Since I didn't make a wrong choice, then I'll set off. Then he pulled the reins and prepared to ride away. Seeing this, Reed said, Master, please slow down. Our mission is to escort you to the Red Tail River. But since you insist on not going, we can't force you to go. So why don't you let us follow you? All right. Dean's mouth curved. In fact, he knew that Reed and others wouldn't abandon him. The reason why he chose Scarlet Canyon was because it was suitable for small-scale operations. If he went alone, then, even if he killed some barbarians, there would be no one to testify. After all, the most important thing about him was his weak identity as an architect. Moreover, it was impossible to have a big fight in this kind of terrain. With his tough attitude, Reed and the others couldn't help but follow him. Captain, are we? Another swordsman was worried as he saw Reed change his mind. Dean frowned and turned to look at the man. Everyone, raise your hand if you are willing to follow me to kill the enemy. Remember that I'm talking about throwing away the military order. Whoosh. All of a sudden, everyone raised their hands. That's it. Why are you being so sentimental? Let's go. Dean snorted and rode away. Everyone looked at each other. They were stunned and speechless. Reed wryly smiled. Dean was definitely the most wonderful master he had ever seen. but he was also the bravest and most fearless master he had ever seen. Thinking of this, a glimmer of light flashed in his eyes. He licked his lips and said to the crowd, "Everyone, even if the Scarlet Canyon is attacked by the barbarians, there will not be a large-scale battle. With our ability, it will not be difficult to protect the Grandmaster. If the higher-ups want to hold us responsible, I will report the truth and take responsibility." Hearing this, the 20 people looked at each other. The nearest knight holding a spear said with bright eyes, "Captain, what are you talking about? If the higher-ups pursue this matter, I'm willing to bear the blame with you." "I'm also willing." "Me too. I also have a share." All of a sudden, everyone shouted loudly. Reed's heart warmed as he saw everyone's serious expression. "Good! In that case, let's go and kill them. Let's make those bastards go back lying down." "Good." Chapter 383. The sky was dark by the time Dean, Reed and others arrived at Scarlet Canyon. The drizzle had stopped while they were on the way. The dark clouds hovering over their heads had thinned a lot. It wasn't as gloomy as it was a few days ago. Dean stood at the entrance of the canyon and looked up at the steep canyon. From the outside it seemed as if a towering mountain had been cut open by a sharp weapon. There was a narrow gap in the canyon. They could only ride 4 people side by side. Some places were 6 or 7 meters wide, but some places were only 2 or 3 meters narrow. The walls on both sides of the canyon were uneven but extremely steep and difficult to climb. The barbarians shouldn't be here at this time. But we should be careful and guard against the top, Reed reminded. Yes. 20 people answered. Dean and Reed rode side by side. 4 people were in front of them to open the way. They slowly went into the other side of the canyon. Along the way, the sound of horse hooves was crisp and clear. Everyone was silent and vigilant of their surroundings. After a few minutes, they arrived at the other side of the canyon. There was a small forest here, and the faint sound of a stream could be heard from the forest. According to the map, behind the forest was the Blackwater Swamp, where ferocious monsters live. There was only a narrow path at the edge of the swamp. "Master, it's getting late. Let's set up camp and rest," Reed said. Dudian nodded and dismounted from the horse. He came to the edge of the canyon and looked inside. Although it was late, but it didn't hinder his vision. He reached out and touched the uneven rock wall. It felt rough. It was fluffy sandstone which was more absorbent. If he climbed it, it would be easy to fall. Therefore, it was extremely difficult to reach the top of the canyon. However, the Blackwater Swamp behind the Scarlet Canyon and the Magic Hunting Forest on the other side were known as dangerous places. The wars between the knights and the rich in the commercial district would rarely continue to this area. So the military didn't pay too much attention to this natural barren area. However, the barbarians might not know about this. They were likely to come here when they were exploring the way. Moreover, even if these barbarians colluded with the forces inside the giant wall and had the map, most of them would send people here to inquire about the situation. After all, there was no army guarding this place. This point alone could be the reason for the barbarians to come here. "Master, do you want to drink water?" Reed handed Dudian a water bag. Dean shook his head slightly and took out a wide metal tube from his backpack. It was the waterproof thermos cup he smelted in his spare time. "I have water." "Master, you've really thought of everything." Reed sighed as he took back his water bag. "Master, you must be hungry. Would you like to eat some dry food?" Dean looked at the campsite and saw 20 people sitting around several bonfires. The bonfires were close to the rock wall of the canyon. It was not easy to see from the other side of the canyon. At the moment, the bonfires were barbecuing the limbs of unknown animals. Dudian nodded and followed Reed to sit by the bonfire. "Master, please." A blond youth handed Dean a piece of barbecued smoked meat. He was very polite. "My name is Port Allen. I come from the Molly family. Our family is rich in cherry fruit. It's particularly delicious. If Master likes to eat this, then you can come and find me. You can eat as much as you want. Moreover, we have it any time and anywhere regardless of the season. Dean smiled. Thank you, but I brought my own dry food. If there is an opportunity in the future, then send me a few packs to eat. He took out the dry food from his backpack. It was a small piece of compressed biscuit. He had specially made this dry food. It was much more filling than the dry food products carried by the hunters. Moreover, it took up less space and provided more calories. It was also very simple to make. Master seems to be ready for a protracted war. Reed's face was full of admiration. Alan looked at the compressed biscuit in Dean's hand. Master, what kind of bread is this? It looks very hard. Where did you buy it? I made it myself. Dean didn't say much. He put a piece into his mouth and slowly chewed. The taste was unpleasant, but the hunger in his stomach was alleviated a lot after eating a piece. He ate 3 pieces in a row, then tied the bag and sat around the fire to warm himself. The bonfire in his eyes was like a blazing red light. It was incomparably dazzling. The heat is almost covering the body. It would be great if I could freely control my eyes, Dean secretly thought. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. It was still hot and red. He could not help but sigh. Alan saw that Dean didn't hand over the food, so he took it back and ate it himself. Reed took the map from Jesse's hand while eating the barbecue. He looked at Dean after a while. Master, it would take 4 hours for the barbarians to reach here from the Golden Wall. 5 or 6 hours is possible if there are delays on the road. They have just broken through the Golden Wall, so most of the troops should be resting and reorganizing. They should send the vanguard team to continue the attack and survey the situation. So the number of the vanguard team will be small. But I heard that there are red-skinned barbarians who can go berserk and have amazing combat power. We have to be careful. Dean nodded and looked at the bonfire in silence. Reed looked at Alan and Jesse. Be sure to protect the Master if we fight with the barbarians. You guys are responsible for taking care of the Master's safety. The rest of you will kill the enemy. Understood, Jesse said briefly. Alan laughed. Captain, maybe the barbarians will go directly to the second line of defense. Chapter 384. Da-da-da. In the dark canyon, the sound of hooves gradually came from far to near. After a moment, several figures riding strange beasts appeared in the sight of Dean and others. These people were burly, about 2 meters tall, with strong muscles. Their whole body was wrapped in steel helmets, and their mounts were tied with rough weapons. They rushed over quickly. Kill! A cold light flashed in Reed's eyes as he stepped forward. He held his big sword and swung it out with a whistling sound. A barbarian was shocked as he saw Reed and others jump out. He wanted to stop his mount, but it was hard to stop. Instead, its soft abdomen was exposed to Reed's sword. The barbarian's abdomen was almost cut off. Blood sputtered out from the edge of the sword. The barbarian who was on the back of the mount rolled down. Whoosh! Several archers shot arrows at the barbarian. The barbarian wasn't able to get up and was nailed to the ground. On the other side, the shield swordsman and knight were not willing to fall behind. They quickly pounced on a few other savages. Their movements were swift, and they coordinated well with each other. They quickly knocked down a few of the startled mounts of the savages. They attacked with their swords and spears, killing them. Leave one alive! Reed roared as he pulled out his sword from the belly of the ferocious mount. In just a few minutes, 7 or 8 barbarians were caught off guard. All of them were killed. Only one was left alive. But his chest was pierced by an arrow. It wasn't fatal. The battle ended in a blink of an eye. Reed ordered the others to clean up the barbarian's body and the ferocious mount. He didn't want the barbarians to notice them. He brought the surviving barbarian to Dean. Master, there is one alive. We should arrest him and bring him back for interrogation. We have beast language masters in the military who understand the language of the barbarians. Dean looked at the barbarian and shook his head. This is just the beginning. They should be the vanguard of scouts. If they haven't returned, then they will send more people to investigate. Our duty should be to guard this place. Otherwise, we won't be able to compete with them by relying on the advantage of the canyon. The commercial district behind Blackwater Swamp will become their territory. Moreover, it will become an important stronghold for them to encroach on the entire commercial district. Reed was startled. He couldn't help but look at Dean. Finding the Scarlet Grand Canyon was just luck. But now he was able to point out the importance of the terrain. It was a pretty good military vision. Master is really an extraordinary genius. Reed sighed. His eyes fell on the struggling barbarian. His face turned cold as he kicked the barbarian's back. Let's waste his hands and feet. I'll do it. Jessie, who was at the side, took out a piece of cloth and stuffed it into the savage's mouth. She reached out and touched the rock wall of the canyon. She put her hand back to the tip of her nose and sniffed. She seemed to be relieved. She turned back and whispered a string of strange syllables in a low voice. When the wolf cavalry behind her heard her words, 4 of them immediately stepped forward and led the way into the gorge. The slender woman wearing a lion helmet patted the mount. The monster mount followed them without a word. At the other end of the canyon, Reed and others quickly got up after hearing the news from an elite archer. They knew that the prey was coming. They clenched their weapons as their figures flashed. They appeared at the traps on both sides of the canyon. They were ready to wait for the prey to fall into the net. Whoosh! The sound of rustling wind and armor rubbing against each other gradually came from the canyon, but it sounded extremely weak in the howling cold wind. Reed's physique wasn't weak. Apparently, he heard the slight sound. His face changed. He raised his hand to make an ambush attack gesture. Whoosh! 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 At this time, 3 figures riding giant wolves flew over, from hazy to clear, quickly expanding in the line of sight of Dean and others. Their whole bodies were covered in black armor, as if rushing from hell. Dean was startled. There was a trace of surprise in his eyes. These 3 barbarians were riding giant wolves. Their body heat was much more exuberant than the previous barbarians. They were like a group of flames. At this time, Reed roared and took the lead to kill with his sword. Kill! 13 warriors roared and rushed out from both sides of the ambush. Whoosh! Whoosh! The archers who were hiding in the crevices of the canyon took aim. The arrows pierced through the air and hit the bodies of the 3 giant wolf knights. Some of the arrows bounced off the giant wolf knight's armor, leaving only a dent. Plop! Plop! The giant wolf riders were caught off guard, and 2 of them fell from their giant wolves. One of them had his throat pierced and died on the spot, while the other was luckier. The giant wolf he was riding on had its front paw injured, and its body became unstable, causing it to fall. At this time, Reed, the other knights and the shield swordsman had rushed out. However, they hadn't come close when a sharp buzzing sound echoed. They saw an arrow coming from the depths of the dark canyon. It flew over the head of the remaining giant wolf knight and fell down in an arc. It shrouded the place where Reed and others appeared. Not good! Reed's face changed. He hurriedly waved his sword to block the arrow. However, the others behind him were not so lucky. Some of them could not dodge in time and were pierced in the chest, arm, or eye sockets by the sudden rain of arrows. They screamed and fell to the ground. The rest of the shield swordsmen who reacted faster immediately raised their shields and stood in front of their injured companions to cover their retreat. Whoosh! Whoosh! The archers who were hiding in the crevices of the cliff didn't think that there would be archers among the barbarians. They were shocked and quickly pulled their bows and arrows. They aimed at the back of the giant wolf knight. They didn't care whether they could hit the enemy or not. They simply used the number of arrows to offset the enemy's fierce firepower. At this moment, the giant wolf under the feet of the remaining giant wolf rider suddenly leaned forward and fell to the ground, its 2 front limbs broken. On the ground where it ran, in the crevices on both sides of the rock, there was a hair-thin steel wire knife embedded. This was an extremely famous hidden weapon of the military, and it could be said to be a demonic existence in terrain warfare. If used well, it could easily eliminate an enemy 10 times the size of the army. The barbarians behind the giant wolf knight were exposed after he fell down. All of them were fully armed and riding giant wolves. It seemed that they had already expected Reed's attack. They roared and rushed over. Reed's face changed. He was frightened and angry. He roared and waved his sword to kill the fallen giant wolf knight. Then he stood behind the steel wire knife and waved his sword to block the arrows while waiting for the other giant wolf knights to come over. Bang! Bang! The giant wolf knights rushed in front of the steel wire knife. The giant wolf's forelimbs were cut off. Its body rolled down and crushed the barbarians on its back. The giant wolf knight was aghast as he roared in a strange language. The giant wolf suddenly jumped and dodged when the giant wolf knight rushed in front of the steel wire knife. Reed roared as he brandished his sword to kill the wolf riders. He joined the others to meet them. Chapter 385. Quick! You guys go too! Dean said quickly. You don't need to protect me. Guard the canyon. The 6 people around Dean were anxiously watching the battle. They heard Dean's words but didn't act for a while. One of them hesitated. Master, we have to protect your safety. If the captain can't stop them, then we will escort you out of here. Dean's eyebrows rose in anger. He grabbed the armor of the youth and roared, "Fuck you! How can you tell me to leave at this time? What kind of soldier are you? What kind of warrior are you? Your companions are bleeding in front of you and you want to leave? Master? F***CKU. I'm a knight now. Don't F***king block my way. Piss off." Dean pushed the youth out of the encirclement. He almost fell to the ground. The youth took a few steps back as he looked at Dean in astonishment. He couldn't help but smile. Knight? Was there such a rude knight? The other 5 people were surprised as they saw Dean's anger. They looked at each other and hesitated. Get out! Dean roared again. Their faces changed. One of them pulled out his weapon and rushed out of the canyon. It was obvious that he didn't want to care about too much. The others hesitated for a moment but eventually rushed out with their weapons. Only 2 people and the youth, who was pushed away by Dean, were left in the same place. Dean glanced at the shield swordsman who was still next to him. His eyes flashed and he continued to speak in an angry tone. What are you 2 doing? Aren't you going to attack? The shield swordsman was silent and indifferent. The other person was Port Allen, who was sitting next to Dean. He smiled. Mr. Dean, we have to stay to protect you. We can't afford to take the responsibility if you get hurt. Dean's face sank. He didn't say much as he saw the 2 of them insist. He took out the bow from his back and opened the quiver. He pulled out the arrow. You 2 better stay away from me. Don't hinder me. Okay. Port Allen smiled bitterly and retreated. The youth who was pushed away by Dean took a deep breath as he looked at the swordsman and Port Allen. He pulled out his weapon and rushed towards the battlefield in the canyon. Whoosh! An arrow whizzed past him as fast as a streamer. The sharp arrowhead cut through the air and penetrated the eye socket of a wolf knight. The sharp arrowhead slowly pierced his eyeball. The next moment, the wolf knight screamed and fell down. Reed and the others rushed to stab him to death. Whoosh! Whoosh! Dean quickly pulled out the arrow, put it on the string and aimed. The arrow was like a star. It had reached the maximum shooting speed of the bow. However, he only used less than 30% of his strength. It was barely the strength of a senior hunter. Puff, puff, puff. With each arrow, a giant wolf knight would fall. It was as if this was not an arrow, but a summoning, the summoning of the Grim Reaper. The 5 archers who were hiding in the crevices of the rock were surprised to see the arrows. They looked back and saw that the arrows were shot from Dean's hand. They didn't expect that the architect who only knew how to shout would be stronger than them in archery. It seemed that the bow on his back wasn't just for decoration. Several people felt ashamed as they saw this. They quickly shot their arrows. Their eyes narrowed as they concentrated on covering Reed and the others in front. Puff! The sound of an arrow was heard as it fell down and nailed the throat of a wolf knight in front of Reed. The wolf knight didn't have the time to stab his spear as it came to an abrupt stop and fell from the wolf knight's body. Reed breathed a sigh of relief. He hurriedly raised his sword and chopped the wolf's head. The sword split the helmet on its head and split its skull. Kill! Reed's morale was like a rainbow after he killed the wolf knight. He roared as he waved his sword. The wolf knights who were sweeping towards him retreated in defeat. 3 wolf knights were the limit in this narrow canyon. Reed and others had to face the attacks of 3 wolf knights at the same time. They also had to face the arrows from behind. But similarly, Reed and the others could only fight 5 people side by side. The rest of the people were fighting the wolf cavalry in the back. They were cooperating with the 5 archers in the back. They didn't fall into a disadvantageous position for a while. However, as Dean's arrows entered the battlefield, the pressure on Reed and others was greatly reduced. Most of the wolf cavalrymen who were in front of them were either injured or dead. Port Allen and the shield swordsman had the deepest feeling. Dean's arrows weren't the same type of weapon as the arrows of the other 5 archers. Dean's technique was much faster than the other 5 archers. Dean would shoot 5 arrows every time the other 5 archers shot 3 arrows. It was an extremely terrifying progressive number. Moreover, Dean's arrows were different from the other 5 archers. Every time he shot an arrow there would be a wolf knight who would be hit. Moreover, most of the arrows would hit the wolf knight's vital parts. Port Allen and the shield swordsman knew that the 5 archers weren't weak. On the contrary, the youth's archery was too terrifying. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call him a master archer. His arrows would hit the target every time the wolf knight moved at high speed. Moreover, his ability to predict the arrows was extremely high. Alan Port and the shield swordsman knew very well that it wasn't because the 5 archers were too weak. On the contrary, it was because the young man next to them was too horrifying an archer. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call him a sharpshooter. His shots were almost always accurate. Also, when the giant wolf cavalrymen were moving at high speed, he could still attack where he wanted to hit. Especially in the case of rapid shooting, there was no time to predict slowly. To be able to do it like Dean was almost unheard of. They naturally didn't know that this was just the basic skill of a senior archer. Although Dean had practiced archery for a short time, he would practice whenever he had time. Moreover, his physique was already at the peak of senior hunter's level. Coupled with his keen eyesight, it was easy for him to point at the target in this short distance of less than 100 meters. Even if he was shooting at a live target like the wolf knight, there was no exception. After all, the canyon was so big, and the opponent had limited space to dodge. Naturally, it was easy for him to predict the opponent's movements. This was incredible in the eyes of the layman, but in his opinion, it was just the basics. Whoosh! Dean squinted his eyes to let himself see more clearly. He shot at a wolf knight who was about to bite a knight. Dean felt a chill coming from the side as he loosened his fingers. He suddenly dodged sideways. Whoosh! He felt pain in his arm. He didn't have time to look at his arm as he quickly pulled out the dagger and coldly stared at the shield swordsman. Although he had been shooting arrows earlier, he was different from the other archers. He was not fully focused, but part of his attention had been on the shield swordsman next to him with an abnormal physique. Based on the military's speculation, this shield swordsman was either someone sent to protect him secretly in the team, or he was someone who was secretly assassinating him. There were only 2 possibilities. Otherwise, it was impossible to explain why a senior hunter would hide in the team like an ordinary shield swordsman. Moreover, he noticed that the shield swordsman was intentionally or unintentionally getting close to him. Even when Reed arranged people to protect him, the shield swordsman quickly stood in a conspicuous place. Dean quickly moved in front of the shield swordsman, swung his injured left hand and smashed it on the swordsman's chest. The shield swordsman's chest armor seemed to be dented. Dean's eyes could see that the swordsman's heart contracted fiercely when the fist came out. It trembled violently, and the flesh and blood around the heart swayed gently, causing the blood flow to be impeded. Puff! The shield swordsman spat out a mouthful of blood and retreated a few steps. Dean caught up with him at a faster speed. The dagger in his hand quickly slashed at the wrist of the swordsman holding the sword. In the blink of an eye, the wrist was cut off. The hand holding the sword fell to the ground, and blood gushed out. The shield swordsman screamed in pain and turned to run. Dean's eyes were cold. He threw the dagger and shot the back of the shield swordsman. The shield swordsman trembled in pain and almost fell, but he didn't know where the strength came from, but he still staggered and ran quickly. Dean put an arrow on the bow, took aim, narrowed his eyes, and suddenly shot. Whoosh! The arrow pierced the back of the shield swordsman and nailed him to the ground. From the sudden attack of the shield swordsman to the counterattack of Dean, only about 10 seconds had passed. Dean put away the bow and quickly rushed over. He saw that the shield swordsman had died, but he was not killed by his own arrow. Black poisonous blood was flowing out of his mouth, exuding a strange smell. At first glance, he knew that it was a very fast poison, so that he wouldn't be saved when he committed suicide. Poison? Dean was shocked when he saw the black poisonous liquid. He hurriedly looked at his left hand. His left hand was swollen. It was as thick as his calf. The wrist guard on his left hand was bulging. Because there was no pain nerve damage in his left hand, he didn't feel any difference. The sword is dipped in poison, fuck. Dean cursed. He hurriedly untied the left wrist guard, tore the sleeve, and tightly tied the left shoulder to prevent the poisonous blood from flowing back to the heart. Master! Alan reacted and hurriedly ran over. Looking at Dean's poisoned left hand, he hurriedly said, Master, you are poisoned. Let me bleed and bandage your wound. Dean took a deep breath and said, Hurry up, disinfect and bleed. Yes. Alan turned around and touched the dagger, took out the first aid kit, and took out a lot of small things. Dean stared at his left hand. Now that he didn't have the magic mark, his resistance to these toxins was greatly reduced. He suddenly realized that he should habitually bring some first aid detoxification drugs in the future. Hurry up! Dean turned his head to urge Alan. Who would have thought that as soon as he turned his head, he would see Alan holding a dagger towards him. Alan's face was full of murderous intent. The dagger was pitch black and flowing with liquid. Obviously, it wasn't disinfectant alcohol. Dean's pupils shrank. He quickly rolled on the ground to escape Port Alan's thrilling stab. He turned over and climbed up. As soon as he stood up, he saw Port Alan chasing him, waving a dagger to stab his chest. There is another one? Dean's eyes widened as he dodged Alan's attack. He raised his knee and hit Alan's abdomen. His right hand grabbed Alan's throat and twisted. With a crack, Port Alan didn't even have time to scream before he fell to the ground, dead. Dean gasped for breath as he sat on the ground. He was about to take out his first aid kit to bandage his wounds when he heard the roar of the wolf cavalry. He looked back and saw that Reed and others were retreating under the charge of the wolf cavalry. They were almost out of the mouth of the canyon. Dean slightly gritted his teeth, grabbed the first aid kit and came to the entrance of the canyon. He said to a youth who was constantly shooting arrows, "Come over, bandage me and let me bleed." The youth was surprised to see Dean suddenly appear. He was even more scared when he saw Dean's injured left hand. He hurriedly said, "Master, are you injured? I told you to bandage my wound." Dean didn't have the patience to talk anymore. He roared. The youth was scared but hesitated for a second. The youth was shocked. He only hesitated for a second, but still gritted his teeth and put on the bow. He quickly took out a first aid kit and bandaged Dean. Dean quickly pulled his bow and shot an arrow at the wolf cavalry in front of him. Whoosh! The arrow pierced the throat of a wolf cavalry who was rushing towards Reed. Dean knocked another arrow and another wolf cavalryman fell. The pressure on Reed and others was greatly reduced after the death of 2 wolf cavalry. But no one dared to look back because of the urgency of the battle. Otherwise their heads would be thrown into the sky. The archer, who was about to help Dean bandage the wound, was shocked when he saw Dean's arrow. Dean panted slightly after shooting 3 arrows. He roared at the young archer, "What the fuck are you doing?" The young archer was shocked by Dudien's roar. He quickly took out his dagger and wiped it clean. Then he took out some anesthetic powder and some detoxification powder. "Master, it may be a little painful. Please bear with it." Chapter 387. Don't use the anesthetic powder? Hearing Dean's words, the young archer was startled. He hesitated for a moment, but he still put away the anesthetic powder. He had seen that Dean's arm was infected with a highly toxic poison and must be cleaned and bandaged immediately. The situation was extremely urgent. If he waited for the anesthetic powder to take effect, it would take at least 5 to 10 seconds. This was the best quality military anesthetic powder, and this short anesthetic time was likely to affect Dean's life. "Master, please stop for a moment. I'll bandage it for you. You must hold on." Dean quickly pulled out an arrow and aimed. The arrowhead once again pierced the throat of a giant wolf knight. He turned his head and stared at the young archer. He didn't even have the mood to say a word. He grabbed the dagger from the archer's hand and stabbed it along the wound on his left hand. Black poisonous blood splashed out from the wound. He lowered his arm so that the poisonous blood didn't splatter on the archer's face. Dean threw the dagger back to the young archer as he saw the poisonous blood flowing out. He continued to hold the bow in his right hand and pulled out the arrow with his left hand. "Make another cut on the arm and let the blood out. You only need to bandage it. Don't worry about anything else." The young archer was startled but reacted quickly. He took out the disinfectant gauze and wrapped it around Dean's arm. He forced the poisonous blood out of Dean's arm. Dean took off the quiver from his back and inserted it into the soil in front of his feet. It was inconvenient to take the arrow backhand while bandaging the wound. It was much faster to take the arrow directly in front of him. His eyes were fixed on the place where Reed and others were blocking. Arrows were shot at the giant wolf cavalry that were attacking him. The young archer's bandaging was a bit difficult. Dean's arm was constantly shaking, so he had to move along with Dean's arm. Fortunately, Dean's arm always maintained a mechanical shaking range, so he quickly found a rhythm. He quickly cleaned the wound, forced out the poisonous blood, sprinkled antidote powder, and bandaged the wound. Dean's archery was somewhat disturbed during the process of bandaging the wound. He didn't continue to aim at the throat, eyeball, and other small parts. Instead, he locked on the wolf's body. The sharp arrows easily penetrated the parts of the wolf's body that weren't covered by the protective gear. The barbarian cavalrymen on their backs were also affected. Some of them fell down, although some of them were barely riding on the wolf's body, but it was difficult for them to accurately wield their weapons. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The sound of arrows was like the summoning of the undead. Every time the sound echoed, a wolf would scream and fall down. The morale of Reed and others rose. They resisted the rain of arrows from the wolf cavalry while fighting against the wolf cavalry. The lethality of the wolf riders was greatly reduced after losing the support of the giant wolves. Reed and the others pounced on them and quickly beheaded them. However, in this chaotic battlefield, 2 knights and a shield swordsman were killed by the wolf riders. Their deaths were tragic. It was a cruel and bloody scene, as if they had stepped into hell from the human world. More than half of the wolf cavalry died in the blink of an eye. The passage in the canyon was blocked. The wolf archers behind the wolf cavalry were exposed to Dean's arrows. Dean noticed that there was a very strong red heat behind the wolf archers. It was much higher than the heat emitted by Reed's body. He wanted to warn Reed, but he stopped himself. He continued to use his arrows to kill the wolf archers. The wolf archers lost the protection of the cavalry. Reed and others cooperated with Dean's arrows and quickly beheaded several archers. Even the wolf archers were killed by Dean. Dean turned to look at the young archer who was bandaging his left hand. He saw that his left hand had reduced a lot in just a short time. His heart was slightly relieved. It seemed that the poison smeared by the shield swordsman was not an incurable poison. However, this may be related to the physique of a senior hunter. Although his immunity was not as strong as before, but at least it was much stronger than the majority of senior hunters. If an ordinary person was poisoned by this poison, it was estimated that they would fall to the ground and die on the spot. But the archer persisted for half a minute. It was less than half a minute from the time he was injured to the end of the battle. Moreover, his left arm was strangled so the poison didn't flow into his body. His brain and heart weren't affected. What a strong poison! The young archer was sweating. He smelled the pungent smell of the poisonous blood. He was frightened. If he didn't disinfect the blood, then it would be too late. Dean pulled out the quiver and put it on his back. He rushed to the front of the battlefield. The young archer's face changed. "Master, you want to?" Dean came to about 40 to 50 meters behind Reed and others. He quickly shot an arrow. The swelling on his left hand had reduced a lot. A lot of black blood burst out from the wound as he pulled out the arrow. The white disinfectant gauze was quickly dyed. Whoosh! Whoosh! The wolf archers quickly fell under the arrows of Reed, Dean and the others. Reed and the others were already in front of the wolf archers. Their attacks became more and more ferocious without the long-range arrows of the wolf archers. Their arrows were always flying at the right time. The wolf archers retreated and fell one after another. A majestic shadow jumped out from behind a fallen wolf archer as Reed and the others were advancing. It was a ferocious beast that looked like a lion and a leopard. It jumped 3 or 4 meters high and directly jumped over the fallen wolf archer's mount. It jumped in front of Reed, who was rushing in front of him. Reed was shocked and hurriedly raised his sword to block. Roar! The lion-leopard monster roared as it opened its mouth to bite Reed's arm. Reed raised his sword to block the monster's attack and bit his arm. Reed's sword was cut by its sharp teeth. Reed was sweating because of the pain. He wanted to struggle, but there was a tearing pain. At this time, he felt a chill on his head. He looked up and saw a shadow like a black scimitar coming towards him. His pupils shrank as he shrank his body. He didn't care about the pain on his arm as he bent down. He heard a cracking sound as his arm was torn off by the ferocious beast. Fresh blood spurted out, and the black scimitar on top of his head also slashed through his hair. A chill went straight to the top of his head, causing his entire body to feel cold. Cold sweat broke out, and he had a terrifying feeling as if his scalp was being kissed by the god of death. "Captain!" A shield swordsman's eyes turned red. He roared and raised his shield to block in front of Reed. Bang! The ferocious monster's front hooves stomped down on the shield swordsman's raised shield. The heavy force came crashing down, trampling the shield swordsman to death under the shield, causing a pool of blood to splash out. However, the moment the shield was trampled, the shield swordsman reached out and pulled the injured Reed away from the ferocious monster. Reed saw the pool of blood under the hoof of the monster. He roared and used his other arm to pick up the spear of a dead knight. He roared and rushed towards the ferocious beast. There was a slender woman sitting on the back of the ferocious beast. She was wearing a fur armor and a lion helmet. She saw Reed rushing towards her. She coldly snorted and waved her black scimitar. Whoosh! Suddenly, a horrifying cold air attacked him. The slender woman's pupils shrank as she hurriedly bent down. Whoosh! An arrow whizzed past her back the moment she bent down, leaving a dent in the beast fur on her back armor. It almost hid her back armor. The slender woman raised her head. Her wheat-colored face was pale. She felt the hairs on her body stand up. She stared at the front of the canyon. She saw a thin figure standing behind Reed and the others. He was holding a bow in his hand. His expression was as cold as ice. There wasn't the slightest emotion on his face. He was completely different from the hot-blooded warriors in front of him. He was like a piece of cold ice. But she could clearly feel that this youth was the most terrifying existence. It was as if he was the only one in the entire canyon. He specifically shot at the feet of her mount. Even if she was close to the mount, she couldn't use her shield to block the arrows. These arrows were extremely destructive and penetrating. Even the forelimbs protected by protective gear were injured by the arrows. Puff, puff. She waved the black scimitar in her hand as she killed the people inside the wall. Her eyes almost spurted out fire as she stared at the skinny boy. She jumped from the back of the mount. When Yvette jumped over Reed's head, Yvette kicked him on the shoulder. Reed's body leaned forward and fell to the ground. He tumbled a few times. Yvette rushed forward while holding the shield in front of her. She landed on the ground and rushed towards Dean. 4 archers in front of Dean shot at her. But the distance was only a dozen meters. She easily blocked the arrows with her shield. She crossed the distance in the blink of an eye. Yvette's black scimitar quickly hooked over the archers who were hiding in the rock wall. The heads of the archers slid down and were neatly sliced. Dean's eyes were gloomy as he looked at the female barbarian who was rapidly approaching him. He slowly put away the bow and pulled out the sword from his waist. His eyes narrowed as he stared at her. His arm muscles bulged like a preheating engine. He was accumulating strength. Yvette roared as she approached Dean. She waved the black scimitar under the shield. Dean's heart was calm. When the black scimitar was waved, his pupils slightly glanced at it. He clearly saw the trajectory of the black scimitar's movement. It was like a fast flipping photo. There were countless interruptions. Although each interruption was very short, he could feel the interruption. The accumulated time of this interruption was enough for his brain to dominate his body to respond. Tilting his head back slightly, he avoided the black scimitar. At the same time, the sword in his hand suddenly stabbed out, swinging away the black scimitar. At the same time, his left hand suddenly stretched out and grabbed the edge of the shield. Fall! Dean's calm face suddenly raised his eyebrows, and he roared like thunder. Yvette was shocked by the roar. Her arm that was holding the shield was suddenly pulled into Dean's arms. Her arm instinctively pulled back, but she felt the terrifying strength coming from the other side. Her fingers couldn't hold the shield tightly, and it was thrown away by Dean. The shield disappeared into the darkness. Yvette was shocked. She quickly waved the black scimitar to cut Dean's neck. Dean saw the trajectory of the scimitar and raised his sword to block it. Clang! The sword was cut off, but the momentum of the scimitar didn't reduce. Dean's pupils shrank as he quickly bent down. At the same time, the soles of his feet hit the opponent's lower abdomen. Yvette didn't expect Dean to use such a rogue move. She was surprised and quickly used the scimitar to cut Dean's back. She believed that Dean wouldn't be able to fight back in such a posture. Bang! Dean's head hit Yvette's lower abdomen. The heavy force caused his body to fly out and fall to the ground. Yvette's scimitar successfully stabbed into Dean's back and cut open his back armor. The scimitar couldn't pierce through Dean's body because of the armor's resistance. It only left a very long bloodstain on his back. Dean's left hand was injured before, so he didn't feel any pain. Instead, the burning pain in his back aroused a strong killing intent in his heart. He rushed forward with both hands. Before the other side could get up, he quickly reached out and pressed her hand that was holding the weapon. He roared and twisted her wrist. Yvette's wrist was broken by Dean's strength. She screamed in pain. Dean quickly reached out and grabbed her throat. His nails were much sharper than before since he got splitter magic marks. Although he didn't have the ability to cut through metal, but his nails were sharp enough to cut through any material. His nails immediately cut through the skin of Yvette's neck as he used his strength to stab her. No! Yvette screamed in horror. Dean wanted to stop her struggle, but when he heard her scream, he was stunned. Is this in English? Yvette noticed that Dean was absent-minded. Her other hand reached for a stone on the ground. She was ready to attack. Dean seemed to have seen it and suddenly reacted. He twisted her hand and slapped her face. His eyes were full of anger. Do you want to die? Yvette's face was in pain. Chapter 389. Master! Master, are you okay? Reed and several archers quickly came to support. They saw that Dean had subdued the extraordinary female barbarian. They were anxious and shocked. The female barbarian had killed the shield swordsman with ease. They didn't expect that she would be subdued by Dean, who was a master of invention. It was incredible. Dean dislocated the other arm of the female barbarian. He put his knee on her stomach and grabbed her neck. He looked at Reed and others. I'm fine. Kill the other barbarians first. Don't let them run away. Reed and others reacted and quickly went back to defend. The archers who were hiding in the dents in the surrounding rock walls quickly came out and raised their shields to block the sharp arrows of the giant wolf archers behind them. Since this was a protection mission, even though they were lightly armed archers, they were all equipped with shields and short swords to prevent a melee attack. Bang! Bang! The arrows shot by the giant wolf archers fell on the shields like dense raindrops, clanking loudly. Reed squatted in front of Dean. He saw that Dean's left hand was wrapped in gauze. Master, are you hurt? It's nothing. Dean spoke quickly. You look after her. Reed knew that the female barbarian was the leader of the barbarians. She had an extraordinary physique. He quickly held down the female barbarian and called the young archer to tie her up. Yvette was angry. She violently struggled, but her arms were weak. She struggled and rolled on the ground by relying on the strength of her legs and waist. Her neck was held by Reed. Another young archer rushed over and tied her up. Dean handed over the female barbarian to Reed. He quickly got up and took out the bow and arrow from his back. He quickly pulled the bow and shot at the giant wolf archers that were coming from the canyon. Puff, puff. Blood bloomed as the arrows were shot. The wolf archers didn't get close to Dean before they fell down. Some of them died on the spot. Perhaps the leader was arrested, but the wolf archers were crazy. They completely forgot that the best way to fight an archer was to distance themselves. They roared and rushed towards Dean. Dean shot 4 or 5 of them. The barbarians in the back didn't have the intention to get out of the battle. They kept rushing forward. Dean cooperated with the other archers and 2 warriors to resist the enemy. After a few minutes, all the wolf archers were killed. But they didn't fear death. One of the archers didn't dodge and was pierced in the face by an arrow. He died on the spot. Corpses were everywhere in the canyon. Blood flowed like a river. Dean and others were relieved when the last barbarian archer was killed. Some of them leaned against the rock wall and gasped for breath. Some of them quickly ran to the battlefield and searched for the bodies of their companions. Some of them quickly bandaged their wounds and rushed over to deal with Reed's broken arm. Dean put away the bow and arrow and returned to the mouth of the canyon. His sense of smell allowed him to hear bursts of smashing sounds from the smell of blood. It was like the screams of ghosts. His heart was uncomfortable, although he had seen more bloody scenes than this in the past, but at that time he wasn't psychologically able to bear it. But at this moment in the state of synesthesia, he had to bear greater sensory stimulation. This was probably a disadvantage of being too sensitive. He sat down against the wall of the canyon. He untied the gauze on his left hand. Although the previous bandage was good, but the gauze had been soaked with black blood. He needed to change it. Master. Reed came to Dean's side after bandaging his broken arm. I've seen your injury. Was it caused by those 2? Dean looked at him and continued to clean the wound. Yes. Don't tell me that you have received such an order. If so, now is the best time for you to act. I don't have any strength left. Reed smiled. Master, how can I accept such an order? I'll report this matter and give you a satisfactory answer. This is the problem of the military. I'm really sorry that you almost lost your life. It's nothing, Dean indifferently said. There are a few moths in any organization. The military doesn't have the final say. Reed shook his head. There was anger in his eyes. No matter what they think. You have donated the legendary item to the military for free. But there are people who arranged people to assassinate you. They are worse than beasts. They are better than beasts. Beasts aren't that smart. Dean's tone was indifferent. His technique was quick. Soon, the rotten flesh on his left hand was cut off and replaced with new gauze and detoxification powder. His left hand was completely loyal, which made him feel relieved. Reed forced a smile and said, "Master, we have suffered heavy losses this time. I'm afraid it will be very difficult to defend the canyon with the remaining people. Let's go back and ask the military to send people to guard the canyon. It's too dangerous if there are assassins among the remaining people." Dean turned to look at the canyon. He pondered for a moment. "Well, you send someone back to pass the message. The rest of you stay here with me." Reed replied, "Master, there are only 8 of us left. Moreover, some of us are injured. I'm afraid we'll be wiped out if another team of wild wolf cavalry comes. 8 people are enough. I can defend even if another team of wild lion comes," Dean said. Reed was startled. He didn't know where Dean's confidence came from, but he was convinced by Dean's extraordinary strength. But he was still a bit worried. "Master, from now on, you should call me Mr. Do or Knight." Dean patted his shoulder. "Don't worry. I'll retreat if I can hold it. I won't die here. I'll let the military take responsibility." Reed smiled. "I'm afraid that there will be people who want to assassinate you." "It's okay. I'm prepared. I'm also on guard against you." Dean laughed. Reed sighed as he saw Dean's determination. He finally knew why the military allowed the master to go to the battlefield. He was afraid that the generals would be helpless against such a stubborn temperament. After discussing with Dean, Reed picked out a young archer who was lightly injured. He rode a horse and went back to pass the message. "Captain, do you want me to take the 2 prisoners back?" the young archer asked as he got on the horse. Reed shook his head. "We'll send them back together after the battle is over." Dean knew that Reed was worried that the young archer was sent to assassinate him. Reed was worried that the young archer would take the opportunity to kill the 2 prisoners. After all, assassinating Dean in such a critical period represented a lot of things. From the perspective of interests, the military would be affected the most if the assassination was successful. In other words, someone was going against the military. Moreover, it was likely that the person was a member of the military. Even if it wasn't, the person had great power and could penetrate into the top level of the military. It was likely that these people were colluding with the barbarians. That's why they would use the assassination of Dean to attack the military in this critical period. When the young archer heard this, he gave a few reminders of safety before riding his horse away. "I didn't expect someone to assassinate the master. It's too hateful." The others were angry as they knew about the situation. Dean looked at the crowd. "Everyone take a break. Clean up the corpses of the enemies in the passage and pile them up. We'll block the canyon as a barrier. In addition, the bodies of the 2 people who tried to assassinate me should be preserved in a storage bag. We'll be able to find some clues from their bodies." Chapter 390. After the previous fierce battle, there were only 8 warriors left. 10 of them were sacrificed in the battle, and the remaining 2 were killed by Dean because they failed to assassinate Dean. Now one of them was sent back to report the news. Only 7 warriors were left. Including Reed and Dean, there were 9 of them. "Master, have you practiced archery before?" Reed curiously asked Dean as the others were dealing with the corpses in the canyon. Dean checked his bow to see if there were any signs of loosening. "I have practiced for more than a year." "Only for more than a year?" Reed's eyes widened as he was surprised. "Your archery is so powerful after practicing for such a short time? I've seen archers in the army who have practiced for 4 or 5 years. They wouldn't be as accurate as you." Indeed. Another archer said, if it wasn't for Master's help, then we would have been wiped out by the giant wolf cavalry. Especially that female barbarian, she is too strong. Dean indifferently said, the intensity of practice is different. Time is useless. Moreover, many things depend on talent. Reed was dumbfounded. That's true. The young archer's face turned red. If someone else had said such words, he would have refuted a few words. But after seeing Dean's archery skills, he couldn't help but be convinced. Among the 6 skills of the knight, there was absolutely no problem in archery. In terms of horsemanship, he was also fully qualified. He could be called a real knight. Dean turned to look at the female barbarian who was tied to the ground. He looked at Reed and others. Do barbarians speak the language of beasts? Do any of them understand human language? Reed was surprised. Master, why do you say that? I'm just asking. Oh, I heard that the royal family of barbarians seems to know some strange language. It's the exclusive language of their royal family. The rest of the barbarians don't have the conditions to learn it. They only know some primitive beast language which is relatively simple. Reed said. Dean was startled. Royal family? Was this woman royalty among the barbarians? Yvette noticed that the boy who captured her was looking at her. She felt that the latter seemed to be talking about her. She was a little angry, but more worried. She didn't expect to meet such a powerful person inside the wall in this remote place. At this moment, she only hoped that her mount could send a message back to the fortress so that the chief would send someone to rescue her. Dean saw the anger and hatred in the eyes of the female barbarian. He thought of something and asked Reed, "Where is her mount?" Reed was startled as he turned to look at the canyon. His face changed as he quickly got up and ran into the canyon. After a moment he returned. His face was extremely ugly as he looked at Dean. The beast ran away. Dean was surprised. Did he run away? Logically speaking, this savage should have a very close relationship with his mount. Why would he run away? Could it be that after this female savage was captured by him, she used a method that he did not know to send away his mount? He frowned as he looked at Reed. Let everyone collect the corpses and pile up the barrier. If the beast runs back to send a message, then we'll have to face a long battle. Reed was also aware of this point. He nodded and ran into the canyon. He relied on his one arm to help the others to clean up the corpses. Dean adjusted the bowstring and put it back on his back. He got up and came in front of the female barbarian. He squatted down and looked at the contour of her face. He found that it was quite similar to the Europeans of the old era. The ancestors of these barbarians were probably the survivors of the area. It also proved that some of the people survived the devastating disaster. However, how could there be such a situation if the survivors lived inside the giant wall? Some of the people who inherited the global lingua franca from 300 years ago were expelled from the giant wall. A group of people who communicated in a new language were living inside the wall. If the barbarians outside the giant wall were a part of the survivors who were expelled from the giant wall, then the people inside the wall as the winners didn't need to change their language and use a new language. Dean frowned as he couldn't figure it out. Perhaps the answer could only be found in the history books of the barbarians. He hoped that they had preserved this thing. Despicable people inside the wall. Yvette spat out a mouthful of saliva as she saw Dean's face. Dean indifferently glanced at the saliva on Dean's face. He raised his hand and gently wiped it. He pinched her jaw and opened her mouth. Then he opened his mouth and spat a mouthful of saliva into her mouth. At the same time he pinched her throat. She swallowed the saliva. He let go of his hand and quietly looked at her. "Do you still want to vomit?" Yvette looked at Dean. She couldn't believe her eyes. The despicable person inside the wall spat in her mouth? She had a disgusting feeling like she had swallowed horse dung. Her face changed. She desperately coughed and spat out the saliva in her mouth. She looked at Dean and roared, "I'm going to kill you, you bastard! Fuck!" Reed and others heard the words of the female barbarian. They looked back and saw Dean squatting in front of the female barbarian. The latter didn't pose any danger to Dean. They turned their heads and continued to do their own things. F***ck? Dean heard her cursing in English, but his face was indifferent. He lowered his voice and said in English, "If you want to live, then be honest with me. If you provoke me, although I won't kill you, but I guarantee that you will lose some organs that you care about." Yvette was startled as if she was struck by lightning. She almost suspected that there was a problem with her ears. The despicable person inside the wall spoke in the king's language? Did he understand the king's language? Her eyes widened as she looked at Dean. The young barbarian who was tied to the ground was also confused. Although he didn't understand what Dean was saying, but he was familiar with the wording of the language. It was the great king's language. You. Yvette's mouth was slightly open. Her brain couldn't recover. There was a trace of sadness in Dean's eyes as he saw her shocked expression. He could speak English, but he didn't learn it from the superchip. After all, time was limited. It was impossible for him to learn the old language. The reason why he knew English was because he had been abroad when he was a child. To be precise, he was born in the American Empire. In China at that time, people who had a little money and conditions liked to go abroad to give birth to children. Compared to the domestic medical conditions, they trusted the foreign hospitals more. This was a kind of disease. His family was no exception. His parents were researchers. Although they weren't rich, but they had no problem to go abroad to give birth. That's why he was born in a hospital in the United States. He lived in the United States until the age of 5 before returning to his motherland. He learned English from an early age. "As long as you cooperate with me, I can save your life." Dean continued to speak in English. Yvette gradually recovered but still looked at the boy in shock. She couldn't believe that the royal language was mastered by the people inside the wall. Even the members of the royal family were extremely difficult to learn this language. Especially in her opinion, it was even more difficult than hunting a few ferocious beasts. But a boy who was a few years younger than her was able to speak so fluently. It was incredible. "Who are you?" Yvette couldn't help but ask. Dean frowned. "It doesn't matter who I am. The question is whether you want to live or not." "Of course," Yvette replied without hesitation. "Then we will cooperate." Dean stared at her. She glared at Duddian as she spoke. Who would have thought that the teenager in front of her would turn his head and speak a long string of words in the wall's language? "Does anyone know what she is saying?" Duddian turned his head and asked. Reed took a deep breath and smiled. "Master, this is the language of the barbarian royal family. It is said that it is very mysterious and difficult to learn. Our military has been trying to master this language, but we haven't been able to do so." "Yes. Only these primitive barbarians can understand this language." The others chimed in. Listening to her tone, it seems that she is very angry. "Can she understand our language?" Duddian asked. Reed shook his head. "I don't think so. Master, you have to be careful not to let her bite you." "All right." Duddian helplessly looked back. He looked at Yvette, who was glaring at him. "They told me to be careful not to let you bite me. Will you bite?" Yvette's lungs were about to explode as she heard his words. She would rather be killed than humiliated. Although the boy hadn't abused her since she was captured, but his words had made her mad several times. "One day I will bite you to death." Yvette clenched her teeth in anger. Duddian nodded. "So in order to nip it in the bud, should I pull out your teeth first?" Yvette pursed her lips as she stared at Duddian with a trace of tension and anger. Duddian indifferently said, "Tell me the names of these people." Yvette was relieved when she saw that Dean didn't take action. For barbarians, tooth extraction was not only painful but also a shame. Her eyes flashed. "I only know that there is someone called Knorch. I don't know the rest. What I said is true. It's useless even if you interrogate me." Dudian nodded and touched her head. Good girl. Although what you said has no effect on me because I won't believe it. But I can see that there are things that you are afraid of. Yvette looked up at Dudian. What do you mean? Literal meaning. Why are you asking me if you don't believe me? Yvette felt that her anger was provoked again. She suppressed the impulse to roar. You're the enemy. If I listened to the enemy's words to deal with my own people, that would be stupid. What if the information you reported was fake and there was a real traitor hiding in the shadows? Wouldn't I become your helper instead? Dudian indifferently said, As for why I asked you, it's very simple. I just want to tease you. Tease me? Yvette felt as if she had been struck by lightning. Dudien's mouth curved into an imperceptible arc. He stood up and no longer paid attention to her. He turned to look at the canyon and prepared for the next battle. It didn't take long for the corpses of the giant wolf cavalry to be cleaned up and piled up together as sandbags. As for the corpses of the dead soldiers, they were dragged back by Reed and others and buried at the edge of the canyon. Vibrations came from outside the canyon in less than an hour. Dudian, Reed and others were ready. Soon, a group of barbarians riding porcupines rushed out of the canyon. The barbarians noticed Dudian and others at the mouth of the canyon from a distance. They were familiar with the smell of blood in the air. It was the smell of the elite royal guards. The barbarians saw the corpses of the battle wolf cavalry as they got closer. There was no doubt that the royal family was killed here. After their brains reacted to this signal, all of the savages instantly went crazy, roaring and attacking without any regard for their lives. Dudian stood in the middle of the canyon. The arrows swept out like black light as the barbarians entered the firing range. Puff! The throat of the leader of the barbarians was pierced through. The three archers who were on both sides of the canyon were shocked as they saw the situation in front of them. They didn't expect Dudien's range to be so far and so accurate. At this moment, the barbarian team rushed over. The three archers quickly aimed and shot. Puff! Some of the arrows missed and some hit the target. Whoosh! In this arrow, another extremely light and sharp whistling sound rang out. A black light swept out, and with a pu sound, it pierced through a savage's throat. The arrow swept out from the back of his neck, and shot into the chest of another savage behind, penetrating his armor and injuring him. Dean's expression was as cold as frost. He quickly pulled out the arrow, aimed and shot. The whole process was extremely coherent. He shot the second arrow in less than a second. Although it couldn't be compared to continuous arrows, but each arrow would take the life of a barbarian. More than a dozen barbarians were killed by the time the barbarians reached the front of the barrier. There were only 7 or 8 people left in the bat. Chapter 392. The barbarian army fell in front of the barrier after a few minutes. More than 80% of the barbarians and their mounts were killed by Dean's arrows. The rest of the barbarians were killed by Reed and others. They were outnumbered but won a great victory. While the crowd rejoiced, they looked at the young man with the bow in the middle of the canyon with even more awe. Whether it was the barrier he built with the corpses of his enemies or the power of his arrows, everyone admired him. The young man was not only a noble magic master, but also a combat genius. Dean asked the 3 archers to give him their spare quiver after the end of the battle. All 3 of them readily agreed and handed it to Dean without any explanation. Take a rest and pick up the weapons of the barbarians. We have to hold on for a long time, Dean ordered as he sat down in front of the 2 barbarian captives. Reed took out his drinking water and handed it to Dean. Master, take a rest. Dean glanced at him. If you want me to live longer, then don't come close to me and don't give me food. Reed was startled as he thought of the previous assassination attempt. He sighed and took back the water. Master, I'm really sorry about this. It's all in the past. It's not your responsibility, so don't mess around. Dean took out his own water and drank it. If there's nothing else, then go and help clean up the corpses and the battlefield. I don't need anyone to accompany me. Reed smiled bitterly and turned away. The night was as cold as water. Half an hour after the end of the battle, another team of barbarians appeared outside the canyon. The battle started again. This time they relied on the corpses and Dean's arrows to win the battle with 0 casualties. A short night passed. Dean and others were exhausted. They had encountered 4 battles in succession. Although the duration of each battle wasn't long, but it still exhausted everyone's strength. The sky had just turned bright when it started to rain heavily. The bad weather made Reed and the others curse unceasingly. They prayed to the god of light to stop the rain. Dean put on a raincoat and sat in front of the 2 captives. He quietly watched the rain. Yvette and the other savage young man were tied up and lying on the ground. Their armors were quickly soaked by the rain, their hair was wet and stuck to their faces, and the mud splashed from the ground was all over their bodies. If it was just the rain, Yvette could still accept it. She was not a delicate lady inside the wall. But what annoyed her the most was that when it rained, the demon boy next to her was humming a strange song from time to time. He looked very leisurely and didn't mean to shelter them from the rain. Every time the mud on the ground splashed on her nostrils and lips, the anger in her heart burned even more. Dean hummed for a moment. He curiously looked at the female barbarian. "Do you barbarians have a birthday custom?" Yvette licked the muddy water on her mouth and spat it out. She said coldly, "Yes, what's wrong?" "Nothing, when is your birthday?" Dean asked. "What does this have to do with you?" "Just casually asking." Yvette was so angry that she rolled her eyes, but the muddy water in front of her splashed into her eyes. She suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. She wanted to reach out and rub her eyes, but her arms were too weak. She could only squeeze her eyes out with her eyelids. Dean quietly looked at her for a moment. His fingers gently swept across her eyes and wiped the muddy water from the corner of her eyes. He looked up at the hazy rain in the distance. There was a trace of sadness in his eyes. He gently hummed the ballad that his sister once sang. 300 years. The language was still there, but the people were gone. In the vast land, he was the only one fighting alone. The sky and the land were no longer familiar to him. This person, this thing, all of them were enemies. He slowly hummed through his nose and gradually became silent. Feeling the mud in her eyes being wiped away, Yvette couldn't help but be startled. She looked up and the anger in her eyes was gradually replaced by surprise, as if she had seen something incredible. She stared blankly for a long time. When she heard the strange voice stopped, she couldn't help but ask, "What are you humming? Is this the music of the people inside the wall?" Dean turned to look at her. Music doesn't distinguish between national boundaries or types. Yvette was stunned. At this moment, she had an illusion that the boy who exuded a dark and evil temperament a moment ago had turned into a warm and kind beam of sunshine in the blink of an eye. This completely opposite change made her startled for a moment, but she quickly reacted and looked at him suspiciously. She lowered her head and said nothing more. Thinking that the boy must be deliberately teasing her again, she decided to ignore him. The rain didn't stop. There were traces of barbarians outside the canyon. Dean grabbed his bow and ordered everyone to prepare for the battle. After a night of fierce battle, he had become the leader of the team. No one felt that there was anything wrong with his orders. The battle soon ended. The blood was washed away by the rain and the rain stopped. They won with 0 casualties. Shortly after the end of the battle, a cavalry came from the rear. It was the young archer who had left earlier. He saw Dean and others were still standing at the entrance of the canyon. He was relieved. He quickly jumped off the horse and said to Dean, "Greetings, Master. Military reinforcements will arrive soon." Reed and the others were relieved as they heard this. They smiled. Dean nodded and turned to the crowd. "Everyone pack up and prepare for the handover. We will escort the 2 captives back for interrogation. We will try to interrogate them as soon as possible." In the continuous battles in Scarlet Canyon, he had killed hundreds of barbarians and captured a royal barbarian. These 2 meritorious deeds were enough for him to become a knight. The rest could be handed over to the military. Yes. Everyone replied. Dean came to the front of the 2 barbarian captives and whispered to the female barbarian, "We will take you back to the military for interrogation. There will be all kinds of torture to make you confess. I have said before that you have to cooperate with me if you want to live. You only need to confess about the Melon Consortium. If they ask who is the mastermind of the Melon Consortium, then you will say Mr. Mark, Mr. Rudolph, and another person called Caramel." Yvette was startled as she looked at Dean. "These people are your enemies. Do you want to use my mouth to attack them? Aren't you afraid that I will confess?" Dean stretched out his hand to hold her cheek. This slight action made Yvette's pupils shrink. Her hair stood up as she instinctively tightened her cheek. Dean raised his palm, but this time it wasn't fast. He gently touched her cheek. "How could I let you go back alive if I didn't expect this? It's useless for you to confess to me because your companion has already confessed to me once. But no one believes it. So you have to be obedient. No one likes disobedient, pet. Do you understand?" "Pet?" Yvette stared at Dean in anger as she heard the word. Dean smiled and touched the corner of her eyes. "Your eyes are very beautiful." When Yvette heard these soft words, she felt a chill in her heart as if she was bitten by a poisonous snake. She hurriedly lowered her head and gritted her teeth. After a moment, she said, "I promise you, but you must guarantee my safety." Dean smiled. "You won't die as long as you are obedient. But it is inevitable that you will suffer." After saying that, he stood up. Seeing that the others were almost done packing up, he asked the young archer, "Where's the army? Are they not here yet?" Chapter 393. Not long after, a team of cavalry suddenly appeared from behind the canyon, followed by infantry and archers. They came along the narrow road and stopped 7 or 8 meters in front of Dean. A general riding a brown horse quickly jumped down from the horse and rushed to the front of Dean. He nervously asked, "Master, are you okay?" Dean shook his head. "It's not a big deal." The middle-aged general was relieved as he looked at the wound on Dean's left hand. "I've heard that someone in the escort team was bribed to assassinate you. Fortunately, you responded in time and didn't let the thieves succeed. It's the negligence of the military. I hope Master can forgive us. How about you go back and recuperate first?" Dean smiled. The general was not a simple character. He casually said a few words, and the charge of the assassination was placed outside of the military. It was only a crime of negligence. Sure enough, he knew how to exonerate the charge of a crime better than anyone else. "I'll leave this place to the general. I'll personally take the 2 captives back to the military," Dean said to the middle-aged general as he pointed at the 2 captives on the ground. The middle-aged general looked at them and said, "Master, you've worked hard. Leave this small matter to us. This canyon is a dangerous place. You will stay here and guard it." Dean didn't care about the age gap between them. He gently patted the general's shoulder and said in a sincere tone. The middle-aged general stared blankly, feeling a little strange. He was actually being taught by a youth? However, he didn't say anything as he thought of Dean's identity as a master. Dean picked up the female barbarian from the ground and threw her on the back of his horse. He looked at Reed. "One of you stay here and count the number of enemies' corpses so that you can report to the general." Reed was happy. Yes. He knew that Dean deliberately said this to the middle-aged general. He wanted to give them a chance to make meritorious deeds. It wasn't just to protect the safety of the master. The middle-aged general nodded as he didn't care. How many barbarians could they kill with just 20 people? He also understood that Dean wanted to go to the battlefield to make meritorious deeds. Otherwise people would think that he was just putting on a show. Hiya! Dean galloped out. Reed and others saluted the middle-aged general. They carried the remaining barbarian youth and left behind Dean. Only one person was responsible for counting the number of dead barbarians. You only need to confess about the Melon Consortium and the Scott Consortium. Do you understand? Dean lowered his voice and said to the female barbarian who was lying on the horse. Yvette was violently jolted by the horse. Her chest was stuffy and she couldn't breathe. She clenched her teeth and secretly cursed Dean. But she didn't dare to show it on the surface. Did you hear me? Dean leaned closer. Yvette gritted her teeth and said, I will do as you say, but if you don't save me, I will definitely confess to you. You don't even know my name. How are you going to confess to me? Dean said indifferently. He shook the rope and rushed forward faster. Yvette almost spat out blood when she heard Dean's words. Dean and others reached the military headquarters after more than 2 hours of galloping. Dean dismounted and pulled down the female barbarian. He handed her to a general from the military. This is the barbarian we captured when we were defending the Scarlet Canyon. I heard from Reed that she seems to be a barbarian royal. I hope you can interrogate her and get some important information. The general had 3 golden stars and was over 50 years old. The last time Skagen came to the command hall to show the new legendary invention, he was also present. He knew that the fierce killing weapon came from the hands of the young man in front of him. At this moment, he saw the young man face to face for the first time. There was a very close feeling. There was a trace of shock in the general's eyes as he heard Dean's words. He looked at the female barbarian in Dean's hand. He took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. Master Dean is really wise and brave. He is not only an outstanding master of the temple, but also a glorious knight. I'm ashamed to get such a result in the first battle. Don't worry, the military will deal with this matter properly. We will pry out everything from her mouth. Dean said, General, this person is still useful to me. I hope you can spare her life after you are done with her. Spare her life? The general looked at Dean in surprise. Master, why? I want to dissect and see the difference between the corpses of the barbarian royal family and the ordinary barbarians. Perhaps I can infer the living environment of the barbarian royal family or the overall number of barbarians. I can even exterminate the barbarian royal family, Dean said. The general and Reed were stunned. After a moment, the general couldn't help but ask, Master, can you really do this? Dean shook his head. Of course I can't guarantee 100% success. No master can guarantee this, but there is some possibility. So I hope the military can spare her life. Leave her to me after the interrogation. The general was a little disappointed, but then he smiled and said, Since the master has spoken, then I will make the decision. After the interrogation is over, I will send it to the master. I wish the master a smooth progress in your research. If you can help the military to wipe out the barbarians outside the Great Wall, the master will be a hero that will be remembered through the ages. You will be the greatest knight in the Hall of Knights. Dean smiled and sneered in his heart. Dean wanted to separate from Reed and others and go back to their homes. But Reed and others insisted on following him. They said that the war wasn't over, so the task of protecting him wouldn't end. They had to stay by his side to protect him. Dean didn't insist on ordering them to retreat. Anyway, it was convenient to have more people to run errands. As for the friendship of the soldiers, it was good that others had this thing. He felt that he could make use of it. Dean replaced the gauze again after returning to the castle. Reed wanted to inform the top doctors of the military to treat Dean, but Dean refused. There were 2 main reasons for Dean's refusal. The first was that he didn't want his physical condition to be known by the military. The second was that the Melon Consortium and other unknown enemies had infiltrated the military. He couldn't guarantee that the military doctor wouldn't be sent to assassinate him. If the treatment was tampered with, then he wouldn't be able to detect it and would die in vain. Master. Noyce brought the hot soup to the study room. He looked at the black gauze. Master, are you okay? Has the poison been cleared? It's much better. Dean put on clean clothes and took the hot soup. He was about to take a sip when he thought of something. He opened the drawer and took out a silver coin. He wiped it and threw it into the bowl. Noyce was at a loss. Dean stared at the coin for a moment but didn't see any change. He was relieved. He was about to drink but saw a touch of black on the edge of the coin. His face changed as he stared at Noyce. Noyce couldn't help but say, "Master, you." Dean looked at him for a moment and slowly said, "Catch the person who made the soup and ask him why he poisoned the soup." Poisoned? Noyce was shocked. He realized the seriousness of the matter as he looked at Dean's gloomy expression. He turned and ran away. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.